think we're
we will need 3 votes to have an
sure.
approval.
He just can't
minutes.
read it.
I
is
just
all
can't
he's
read it.
saying.
If it pops up, I don't
Oh,
want to.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
He's,
No.
no, he's morally
Thought you meant,
against
like,
making motions.
I didn't
tonight.
read them because I don't have a laptop. Dang.
It's okay.
Standing off.
I see.
I'll second whatever.
I know. All right, let's be thoughtful about this.
Okay. Yeah, this is how this is supposed to go.
Still working? We good?
What?
Luke, you want to pull up YouTube just to be sure? You got, oh, sweet. We ready? All right. All right. I will call to order this Thursday, April 13th, 2023 meeting of the Moab City Planning Commission at 6:03 p.m. In attendance, we have planning commissioners, myself, Kai Marienfeld, Ruben Villapando Salas, and Miles Lofton. We also have staff here, Christina, Anna, and Corey, and oh gosh, Alexi, thank you. I'm like, I know your position and your name flew out of my head. And Alexi here from the Sustainability Department. First item of business, we also have our city council liaison in the audience, Luke Wojciechowski. First order of business is citizens to be heard. In chambers, it does not appear that we have anyone here to be for citizens to be heard. Is anybody on Zoom? If we're providing that as an option anymore, I don't know. And we also did not receive any communications from outside, as far as I know, prior to this meeting about anything on or off the agenda. If for some reason something comes in via email during the meeting, we can absolutely address that. We don't need to be really staunch about it, but for right now, we haven't received anything for citizens to be heard. Next order of business is approval of minutes from our last couple meetings, February 23rd, 2023 and March 9th, 2023. Does anyone have any notes on those, if you've had a chance to read them? Would anyone like to make a motion to approve those minutes?
I can do this one. I'd like to motion to approve the minutes. Both of them.
Yeah.
I
All right.
watched and read them.
We have a motion from Ruben to approve the minutes from February 23rd and March 9th.
I'll second that.
Miles has seconded. All in favor?
Discussion.
Do we have discussion?
There was no mention of stained glass, but I would have.
Oh, I can't today.
All
All right. Once again, all in favor?
All in favor.
Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously for the minutes. Next, we have item 4.1, which is a workshop on the draft ordinance for water efficient landscaping standards. This is a briefing and a workshop. This is not an action item. Again, it's just a more comprehensive briefing than we've had in the past when we've talked about this item in the past. Would you like to take it away, Alexi?
Sure. Do you want to start?
No, I think if you're wanting to share a screen, the way we're proposing to move through these materials is in the active Google Doc that is consistently evolving with our edits. We can make notes live tonight in this workshop format. So it makes maybe more sense than a presentation format to just work our way through the ordinance and the amendments that we've made since our last review, as we've established the full framework and now getting into substantial content. There are components of this that are more specifically generated through the planning department. They're the areas of landscaping that branch into other development areas, specifically the screening and buffering sections. But then working with our consultants, Alexi has been incorporating all of that updated content. So we should have a fairly complete ordinance at this point, obviously a few remaining tweaks, and to ensure that the approval procedures will all flow the way that we're hoping they do. But tonight is really a content section to make sure that what it is content wise we're proposing is in compliance with the Planning Commission's original directives and some of the staff recommendations that are in addition to that, maybe some of the explanations. So in the packet, Alexi did provide a number of questions that had essentially a yes or no or a directive. And then tonight, that wasn't in the packet can be accompanied by the pros and cons list surrounding some of those questions. So this is just meant to be a really open discussion, work through the ordinance as best we can. So if there's any areas that we want to slow down on, we can certainly do that. But I think for the most part, to get through it, we know just from a staff perspective, it takes a while to get through it. So Alexi, I'll maybe turn it over to you as far as the overall ordinance updates and where we want to go.
Do you want me to go ahead and move just like to the water conservation pieces? I think screening and buffering come before.
If we want to, it could be that we maybe evaluate those questions off the bat, make sure that we get those in our minds, and then can work through actually answering those questions on the back end.
Okay. This is a little bit different version of the questions that you got, but essentially these are what we want to go through, and then they line up to the order they are in the ordinance. So we'll go back to them. But I guess I'm going to go through these briefly just so we kind of know what the order of business is. So we're interested in hearing more about plant material and if it should be required and how much. Trees have can come up from the engineering department is something that we need to be sure that we're including in this in the right of way. So we want to talk a little bit about public trees and some of the rules about those. Artificial plants and whether or not those are allowed, including artificial turf. How much is too much grass? This has a few different things. The idea originally was to ensure that people have spaces that can be efficiently irrigated, but what it does is it also creates a minimum area of grass, meaning you might have to plant more grass than you want. So we want to talk about that. Whether or not we're requiring mulch, whether or not we're allowing water features. There's some issues with water sense fixtures. Some of them are included in this, and we want to know if the Planning Commission is interested in including more. Requirements for plan submittals at the end. There are 3 different levels of plans, and which assortment of requirements apply to each one is something that we'd like to go through. And then finally, there's some exemptions and exceptions, different situations in which people do not have to follow the rules. We want to make sure we're including or not including everything we want to. And then talking a little bit about the process for how can somebody get an exemption or exception? What do they need to do that for? Okay, I'm going to go back to the ordinance.
And then from here, Alexi, maybe we can just knock screening buffering out if we would like to.
Yeah.
Do
Do you want to start with the definition?
Yeah, with
Okay.
you driving, that might make the most sense. So to start off, the paring down of what had been a multiple vernacular in the sense of buffer, buffering, screen, screening, walls. There were multiple elements that were kind of being overlaid within each other with different requirements placed on different particular language elements of that. So where we are taking this is to essentially consolidate what is the essential meaning, the base level ordinance, resolve some of the issues that we found through our more recent development approvals, and then propose in compliance with what some of the plant materials or landscaping requirements are adjacent to the landscaping ordinance. So with the definition being the base of this, we essentially shrunk the numbers and spaces into a buffer, which is a horizontal space, a screen or screening specifically, which is a vertical barrier, and then buffering, and this is where it will be unique, is the difference between buffer and buffering. Buffering being the action word or the verb of what is actually happening in a combination of vertical and horizontal use. So it's the base level of what we've been consistently approving over time, but we're articulating in a way that is more clear and a little bit more regulated than what we currently have. It actually is adding requirements, whereas before there were elements that actually conceded what may have been a more complete or intensive buffering requirement. So with buffer, to read it verbatim, a horizontal distance between adjacent uses or properties occupied by landscaping elements, excluding pools and spas. That can be a component for discussion tonight of the landscaping elements. Those were the two we identified as potentially not meeting the essence of what a buffer space should be. We can reintroduce those, that those would be allowed within the buffer zone, or add more things from the landscaping elements that would not be allowed. Continuing berms, swales, underground utilities, retention areas, screening, site obscuring fences, walls, landscaping screening, or other features that individually or in combination reduce impacts on adjacent land uses or areas. So a lot of that language is going to be really familiar because it is a culmination of this, essentially the materials we've already had, but in a cleaned up fashion. So that's the buffer, the horizontal space. Buffering, the next definition, means the use of a horizontal buffer and vertical screening to reduce the impacts on adjacent land use areas or uses. This can be also a topic of discussion of, do we want to define these things separately, or is buffer and buffering sufficient to be implied that way? The reason we're breaking it out is in applying that as a regulatory fashion, it is good to define what the elements of requirement are, and then what the overall action of the regulation is. So when we get down to the now amended supplementary code where this all comes in, it maybe will read and make more sense why those two things are broken up. Are there any questions on particularly what your thoughts are on excluding pools and spas from the buffering area? Reason being, those are active use areas where again, I'm getting a lot of nods, so maybe we don't have to spend time on it.
I'm inclined to agree with it, at
Mhm.
least personally. I do
Yeah.
think the use of a pool or a spa is very different from what we're trying to define as like a landscaping buffer.
Perfect. Then we'll go ahead and move on. I think we're all in agreement there.
Yep.
So let's jump down to screening, or excuse me, landscaping, if we wanted to touch on that, Alexi. We didn't adjust this to a significant extent, but we did tweak and remove some language that was creating issues for us. Alexi, do you want to comment on maybe particularly water features or any of the other like foundation components that were taken out?
Yeah, we took out foundations because the code says that you need to landscape 70% of your like property. And we were talking with the consultants and they were like, well, why only 70%? And the answer is because your driveway isn't your landscaping. So including foundations was confusing in terms of why that would be part of your landscaping, but your driveway isn't. So we took out foundations as being part of your landscaping. I think most of the other things were already in there. We did take out some language about in a harmonious manner because it was not something we could actually define or enforce. And then we added in the bottom some things about what is not landscaping. So that would include things like foundations, but like a driveway or things that water cannot infiltrate.
Stupid question.
Mhm.
70%, is it still 70%?
It is, and that is a different part of the code where that was defined.
Is that the whole property?
No, this particular section, which is actually referenced right under our little window here. I don't know if in Zoom land it's showing up the same.
Oh, it's, yep.
Our gallery view here on the comment end of
Let me see
things.
if I can move it below the box there. Okay,
Yeah,
so that's
essentially,
just a copy and paste.
so within the supplementary section, but within what was a different detached landscaping requirement section, the purpose for this is only specifically towards front yards. And again, difference of yards or buffering areas of definition. This is about front yard or street abutting side yards or corner lots, so to speak. From that character aspect of maintaining what I've in the past described as kind of the mid-century subdivision style where everyone has a similar type frontage. So the 70% to 30, that distinction makes sense when you have a minimum frontage lot of 50 feet. Your minimum driveway standards are 10. And so that correlates nicely to basically have your appropriate driveway width and then the rest of it being lawn. We're getting away from that. But right now we were wondering if we wanted to amend the percentage or just remove this altogether. But I think this does protect us more than it hinders properties. Or I guess maybe that's not quite the right way to say that. This is a challenge for some developers because they're trying to hardscape more of their frontage to accommodate more parking or more patio space. So this does retain a certain level of character that would be landscaped appropriately after
Yeah.
this ordinance goes through. So we've thought to maintain it, making sense at this point.
Yeah. I'm torn on it. I think there's some properties where it, doesn't make sense or space is best maximized. I mean, there's already properties in town that have either redeveloped or just decided to turn the whole front yard into a parking driveway, like
Mhm.
even up in like Walker Tusher, so
Right.
it's the older neighborhoods, certainly.
And those right now, when they come in, because those were usually done without any permitting,
Yep.
no concrete, no building permit,
Yep.
they were just done. They're legal non-conforming, so they are burdened to come back into compliance now. So given our improved landscape standards, it is a good tool mechanism that if they're either changing the density or adjusting the property in a way that it removes them from that protected status, they would have to re-engage, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
The only area where this gets funky is because it is designed basically around a subdivision style, meaning all lots are the same consistent size. Well, what if you have a lot frontage that isn't 50 feet?
Yeah.
It's 150 feet. Then that 30% gets a whole lot larger of hard surfacing, which gets a little weird. Yes, they still have a maximum driveway width
Yeah.
requirement, but it can get more odd about patios and other things. That's happening less and less because more and more properties are dividing within themselves, not going the other way. So I think that's the exception to the rule where we're running into issues there. So again, the lesser of two evils to maintain this because it does protect character. While there are some development issues, those are usually able to be mitigated in other ways.
Luke, did you?
Just like Brandon talked about that for those like one-off scenarios.
Yep. Get on the record, man.
For those kind of more one-off scenarios, can we do something where it's like a 30% or a maximum size that is determined, like whichever one is smaller of the two?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a
And
good
we could
idea.
build it right into the existing section.
Thanks. That was City Council Member Luke Wojciechowski. Yeah, I like that. And read the question, does excluding artificial plants cause issues for active recreation areas? So like if you have a patio area that's got fake shrubbery or something like that, which a lot of people do just for ease of upkeep and I don't know, Instagrammability, something. Yeah, I understand wanting to have not all fake plants, but
Do you want to, since we're there,
Wanna
do,
go back?
do we want to bring that up? We can always bounce back here.
oh, sorry, I just saw that in the comment.
No,
yeah,
let's
it was-
let's do.
At some point, it was a discussion whether artificial plants are in the definition of a landscape or not. So right now they're mentioned in the general standards here. And it's currently written in such a way that they would be prohibited. And the artificial turf can only be used in active recreation areas, like in places that you need for season turf. However, that is one of our questions, is what level do we want to allow or not allow artificial plants? So it could be nothing, it could be active recreation only, just turf, it could be specific applications like front yards or commercial properties, or it could be in any application, which would let people put it in park strips or street frontages or wherever they want.
I don't have a problem with artificial turf. I'm thinking of like other water short areas in the country, California, Arizona, Nevada. Their artificial turf is a pretty common thing, particularly in backyards. If you want to have play space for kids and pets, it's easy to clean. It doesn't have the environmental benefit of other forms of plant material, but it keeps dust down, it keeps weeds down, and provides a space without people having to plant turf. So I think just gut wise, I don't really have an issue with it. um, you know, in front yards, maybe that would be the line you'd draw just as far as character of the landscaping goes. There are definitely some folks in town that have turf in their front yard and people are really sort of gripey about that in the neighborhood. So maybe that's a way to sort of draw that so you don't just have people just rolling out artificial turf everywhere, but you're still allowing that active space. Or like there's definitely some yards in town where it's like, man, it'd be great if they had turf instead of like a goat head filled in the back or the side yard. So
Don't even get me started. I'm totally cool with artificial turf as well. When we start talking about other artificial plants, are we talking like trees in the middle of the street and like the right of way?
It could be whatever
They're like
people want, right? Like if they want plastic plants in their yard, they could have them. If we allowed just any kind of artificial plant.
yeah.
Where we might pivot with this, because this was
Yeah.
a recommendation from the administration, specifically city manager who has kind of an advanced background in water quality, is there is a not just a storm drainage component to this, but also a water quality
Yeah.
element. And
Through
I
the
don't, I'm not qualified
microplastics,
to,
yeah,
but the microplastic elements of
think
this.
about microplastics, like plastic degrades in the sun and it could end up in water.
Mhm.
Some of the other reasons people don't like it is because there are also chemicals that can leach out. It can absorb heat, so it can radiate that heat during the day, or like in evenings after the sun's gone down. And usually infiltration of like stormwater isn't as good off of like artificial turf. However, it does provide like low maintenance, right? It's good for pets in some cases. It's good for like all season playing. Like you don't have to worry about your field being muddy. So there are some advantages too.
And this conversation is perfectly framed in kind of this pros cons list that we do have. I think the planning staff has gone through the same mental exercise that you've just done of, well, it's really good for these elements and it really wouldn't be that bad for these elements, but there are these contributing factors as well. So let's sit on that for a moment, maybe come back when we do get back to our list.
Mhm.
So just in the back of your minds, kind of be processing that a little bit of
Cool. Thank you.
the,
The water element feels like a significant factor in that. And that feels like the best reason for also other people to introduce turf because of the water bit.
Mhm.
Especially when it's actively encouraged.
I'll agree with that, especially from a like commercial perspective. In commercial properties, like why water a lawn that is just for show when it could be turf that is not taking up that kind of water.
let's,
So did you want to go back? up
yeah,
to
let's jump. So
next?
we're
Yeah.
kind of pinning to pin, but let's jump back up to definitions quickly. Thank you so much for driving, Lexi. So we'll go to, I
This
think,
is really clearly presented also. Thank you so much. Like visually, it's very helpful. So I appreciate that.
thank you, Alexi. This had a lot more color on it in previous.
Yeah, I do my little-
renditions, so it feels more complete at this point.
Yeah.
We're comfortable moving beyond landscaping. It did have those components of prohibited landscaping as well, so I think we're good there for the moment. The next definitions from the planning side are screening and then landscape screening. Similarly to buffer and buffering, needing to break those out because of the regulatory elements. Excuse me. Screening means a vertical barrier, including opaque fences, walls, site obscuring fences, or landscape screening situated between adjacent uses or properties, or maintenance, trash, storage, loading areas, constructed or planted to reduce impacts on adjacent land areas or uses. Where there's a difference in elevation, this is quasi-regulatory. Where there's a difference in elevation on the opposite side of the screen, the height shall be measured from the highest elevation. The reason that quasi-regulatory is in the definitions is because that will be forever the way we've maintained it. So it's almost in essence part of the definition. But really the screening is just to identify, it is just the vertical component. And then here are the elements, like we said with landscaping, elements that create screening and can be used either in combination, meaning different sections of the property maybe utilize different factors, but it must be screened consistently that way. Next definition, landscape screening is taken directly from our existing code. There aren't many places where this is a standalone requirement, but can, I think, often be used in combination or in addition to other buffering elements, which is evergreen shrubs, ornamental walls, / planters, berms, or other densely planted shrubs or vegetation closely spaced, maintained at a substantially substantially the specific height of said required screening when not when not otherwise specified. Natural screening, which is going to be those vegetation or planted elements, shall be maintained at that specific height, similar to what we were just talking about with maintaining the height of adjacency, so quasi-regulatory there. This is a heavy language element that won't often be used, but we do need to have it in there for the rare and few cases that it is required. Any questions on those two components?
No.
I don't think I understand the elevation part. Yeah. if you
Sure,
can
I
pull up the whiteboard.
apologize for those at home. I brought my
Whiteboard.
handy dandy whiteboard. And I'll
this.
try to narrate as I draw.
You're like, what's his name on CNN during the elections? Remember the guy? Like he got kind of popular with his little touch board. What is it? Oh, MSNBC. Wrong news
So
network.
on my board, I've just basically drawn an elevation sketch, which is a horizontal line showing a angled boundary where an inclined boundary. So where a property line sits on one of these inclined boundaries or on a retention area or retaining wall, if the measurement was to be from the base property or maybe the developing property that is lower, a 6-foot fence would be ineffective in that the retaining wall is potentially higher or the slope is even higher. So it would become now a debris basin or safety hazard for those falling down into it. Where the 6-foot measurement would be from the highest point, then creates an effective boundary from whoever's on the high ground. So yes, from the lower slope, it may be a 6-foot screen on top of a 10-foot slope, but that will more effectively screen or create the intended mitigation rather than the screen being measured from the lower side.
Yep.
I apologize for those at home. Hopefully,
So if you're standing in your backyard and there's a hill that goes up away from your house to a property that backs up to yours on the back, the fence would not be at the base of the hill in your yard. The fence would be at the top of the hill at the edge of your neighbor's yard.
right,
And
Yeah.
then measured from the higher side as well.
right. And this is, to think about this in a retaining wall aspect is a lot easier. The slope becomes an issue, but the retaining wall is quite clear. So yes, this area, it might be observably quite high, but this will preserve the rights of the neighbors equally as opposed to, if this were maybe not 10 feet, but say it was a 3-foot retaining wall, something small, then now you're only putting a 3-foot fence on the upper hillside, which could almost become a tripping hazard or issue for that other adjoining property. So
That
Yeah.
makes sense. It was the silly slope that really got me. Because
Yeah.
I figured, well, if you have a straight line, there is no height. Like, that's the point that you measure is the property line. It makes sense with the case.
Right. right.
Moving along.
Thanks, Corey.
Thank you.
That concludes some of our updated definitions. So we'll just scroll down now to this supplementary section, which is kind of the standalone section from the planning aspect of this. We've renamed it. It was screening and buffering to buffering and screening. I know that's silly, but what this layout is essentially doing, and the commission may not have had a chance to review this. This was only just done today. So this is fairly new as it is this active document. But basically putting a consolidated area to what would be our zoning boundary, which is going to be more of an intensive boundary, and a standard boundary, where maybe a particular use, a particular overlay or ordinance will say this use shall provide buffering. The buffering is already outlined in this chapter, so it doesn't need to be specifically outlined in that use, where now every particular use or every particular ordinance has a different version of buffering. It will be consistently standard. And then the zoning boundary buffering will be also consistently standard wherever that border is occurring between non-residential zoning districts and the residential zone. Anna worked pretty diligently on consolidating these and actually referencing out to other communities that have similar type ordinances for buffering. This is the outlined written content. So let's scroll down a little bit. We're also providing matrix and figures in the form of images to help kind of explain this. So these are rough drafts. We'll obviously beautify them a bit, but they certainly do help convey what we're talking about. Is there's essentially two types of buffering areas or areas of intensity that need to be mitigated. One is that zone boundary and one standard. Here, what we're proposing is to, rather than reducing the plant material content, is to regulate that plant material content over a horizontal distance, both in depth, meaning between the two properties, and also along that property length. So in the image on the bottom left, you're looking at that site plan view, and it would basically identify where that dotted line is, would be the required screening in the form of fence, wall, or other qualified screening by the definition. And then within the buffer area, the horizontal distance would be the incorporation of canopy trees that are a regulated amount of canopy trees, ornamental trees, and shrubs, spaced and distanced with some flexibility, but trying to maintain that there is a continued mitigation throughout that whole wall set. Now, within the zone boundary specifically, being a more intensive boundary, we've reduced the distance between living plant materials to 20 feet at maturity. So the biggest gap you can possibly have would be 20 feet, but they can certainly be closer to that depending on aesthetics and how else you'd like to regulate that space. Screening height up to 8 feet rather than what was the standard 6 feet. So we've increased the height there, and then have maintained the horizontal distance where we have discussed in Moab, the limited building area that we have within our valley is a difference between 10 to 12 to even 15 feet, really making an effective difference on mitigating what we're perceiving as the cross boundary issues. So in our previous ordinance, you could, the way the ordinance was structured, provide a 15-foot horizontal buffer with minimal vegetation, but no vertical components, and that would satisfy your screening. But essentially what you could have at that point is a very high intensity use that is immediately next to a lower intensity use with no vertical components of buffering.
Mhm.
So as staff, we really did have to wrangle in on how to both utilize horizontal and vertical elements in a reasonable way. I think we all have agreed that diminishing the horizontal buffer to nothing is not good, but also expanding it out to 20 feet, 30 feet, it really becomes a arbitrary amount of mitigation at that point. So what we'd rather do is focus heavily on the buffer area that is occurring in a smaller area, which means added vertical screening, added plant material, and ground covers without allowing elements that we don't want to be in that space, like Miles was suggesting, like we talked about with pools and spas or accessory structures. It needs to be maintained because that then becomes active space that is now pushing even closer to that fence line. This is where we took the last suggestion from Planning Commission, which was on a more scaled matrix of saying the more intense it is, the more screening there would have to be. And the more and more we looked at that, it became that we were just penalizing different uses more and more, but the effectiveness of the mitigation was not. So we went from 5 different types of buffering levels to 3, and now essentially down to 2, which I think effectively meets the needs. And now buffering becomes a standardized tool rather than a somewhat penalty for intensity of use. If it's an effective tool, then it works no matter what the use is, in theory, or is to the best of our ability without putting, multi-layered sound barriers between people. Anna, I'll kind of leave it to you, or you maybe want to fill in the gaps there on some things, and we can certainly scroll back up to some of the additional components of the language. So these are the diagrams that express what the language is saying. But I'd like to get maybe Anna's input to fill in the gaps and then open it up to discussion before we talk about some of the framework here. If you have anything.
I don't really have anything. I could answer questions, but I think you covered pretty much everything that we've discussed as a group and what my research was based on. So
Okay. Then Alexi, let's scroll up to subsection 1 of this and just quickly walk through this framework. The zone boundary buffering, section 1, it's exactly what you saw in the tables, spelled out clearly, but it essentially maintains the same information. And then scrolling down to standard buffering, same thing, specifying in particular what those regulations are outside of the figures. And then this subsection 3 is more of a regulatory language of how to maintain and install the landscaping components. So a fence is easy, a horizontal distance is easy, but now that we're filling them with living plant material as a requirement, we have to designate how, which, where, those elements for our approval standards in the landscaping plan. So part of it is regarding the trees, they have to be a certain type of tree at a certain growth state. And I did add some language. I was hoping to get some insight from Alexi that I hadn't seen yet, or from Anna, is that regarding these tree elements, which within our tree stewardship ordinance, we have very similar language to this as far as replacement trees. So this isn't out of the blue that we're taking these type of regulations and implementing them, but wanted to clarify, added time of installation versus a tree that has a capacity of a 1.5 inch. I think that's implied here, but I just wanted to clarify, like at the time you install it, it has to be that size of a tree, not it'll be there. So anyway, that's fairly easy. Examples of the clustering, depending on your landscaping, your existing landscape to the property, you maintain some flexibility within the clustering, or how you're going to more creatively cluster to make the development flow in a way that is attractive or aesthetic to the particular development. And then also accounting for existing plant material. So if you have a mature tree, don't cut it down to place other trees at intervals, use that tree and it'll actually count as double towards your tree count. And then same thing for shrubs.
and that's what the flexibility is toward for how far apart vegetation can be. So
Mhm.
yeah, we don't lose the trees we don't want to lose, or the shrubbery even. No,
And let's scroll down.
it's
number 4.
established.
Maximum spacing between trees.
Well, maximum
that?
between vegetation.
25 feet.
Yeah,
So the max can't be less than 25.
it can't be more than 20 feet apart.
So you couldn't have a big property line and one tree at one far corner and one tree at the other far corner and nothing in between. if
Maybe I
it's-
read
I
it
think
wrong.
you're right. The maximum spacing at maturity. is the
There
way
was a
that's
bit, and I
defined.
thought that it said. cannot
And it
be
may be in the
less than-
numbers. I flipped that.
Yep.
I thought I had that consistent, but I'll double check that. I know exactly what you're talking about.
It felt wrong and it just felt like a hand error. So
So I have a question. This is something that comes up actually quite a bit. I've seen with new developments or sort of replacement trees around town. Things get planted, it meets at the site plan, it's built, and then they die, and then they're never replaced. Does that just become a code enforcement issue that takes forever and ever to actually happen? Or is there some purview of follow-up on this?
Yeah, so yes, if you want to scroll back up, Alexi, I'm sorry. The last line of
Just
that
'cause I haven't
section
seen this.
3 is it doesn't have a home yet.
Okay.
We know about where we want it to be,
Yeah,
but is that the trees and shrubs shall be maintained
yeah.
to the standard,
Yeah.
which will be an enforcement component. Now that we have a more clear picture of what we're actually requiring, because if it's your tree and it dies, there's a certain level of when it becomes a nuisance or abatement issue, that's when we start taking effect. But if it's not a required tree, other than in city right of ways, which we do manage and take care of through this tree stewardship ordinance, this will be a standalone now that this is a required section on the private property that we're requiring it. So it must be maintained because it's part of a mitigated effort.
Yeah.
So that is exactly where we highlighted that.
And that should also cover like any encroachments on the neighboring property, like if we put the canopy tree up and it flows over onto the neighboring and becomes a nuisance for them, then it is the property owners, it's their responsibility to trim it back and maintain it type of thing too.
Oh,
Because trees will be so close, we have
That's
20,
new.
25-foot canopies.
Yeah,
And it's 5 feet from the property line, there's gonna be potential overhang if it's unmanaged. We acknowledge that, but it's also, we're hoping cooperation between neighbors, or at least the maintenance will keep it managed, that
Yeah.
will be mitigated between.
so were
between
you
those
saying
properties.
that there is a requirement that the person whose property the tree is growing on maintain?
Yes,
Yes. They're
That's
the tree
different than
owner.
from state law where it's.
overhanging your
oh,
property, it's to the
It's your
sky.
tree now, if it's
Because-
overhanging your property.
Where we're gonna see this is on a commercial district that we're requiring they do that because they want this
That's
higher
quite
end
good,
use.
actually. I like that.
So we'll have to see
distinction.
if that conflicts with some property owner rights.
Most
Um,
likely we'll need to run it by the attorney.
Yeah,
as
if
a-
it doesn't though, I think especially if we're, because that is
Because we don't want to burden a neighbor
it's a
by a
huge
commercial
burden for
development coming in
residents, for residents.
to have to
who's-
pay for all
yeah,
that.
exactly.
So that's the way we're framing it. Yeah, we do have to clarify all this,
Yeah.
all of these components through our attorney in the land use
That does
review.
make a lot of sense, though, being that we're requiring them to have these big canopy trees so close to the edge of their property.
Mhm.
Like, sorry, it's yours now. Deal with it.
I mean, and that's the hope is that neighbors will appreciate the fact that they will have a
Yeah.
Yeah.
tree, which will be casting shade, hopefully, which they appreciate in our hotter climate. And
In 101-degree weather in
Yeah.
July.
Plus
Yeah.
it's a cottonwood that drops giant branches on the neighboring property.
those will not be
Well,
part of
Yeah.
these canopy trees. I think that we're
I think the
designating.
only way the places those are appropriate are floodways and, things like that.
That's good. 'Cause they're
Um,
fast growing.
They
Yeah.
are. So to move on to this subsection 4 is screening. This is the other area of screening, which is why it's a separate element from buffering, is screening of enclosures, smaller elements, not just the property boundary elements, but this was all language that mostly existed completely within that supplementary code that was already in there. We've just refined it out to include the updated terms and then some of these conditions that would lead into this section 5 exceptions category. Now, this was another component we've talked about with planning commission, which is there are inevitably going to be scenarios where this situation doesn't make sense on a property. We want to create an opportunity for that developer or landowner to come in and essentially request, not in the official petition format, but very similar to the way we do parking, is a discretionary action for planning commission to interpret the site. And so those mechanisms are built in here for the zone boundaries or even for screening elements of, say, mechanical areas that maybe don't make sense or things like that. They can come petition why that's maybe overkill, or in the plan commission's case for a standard standard site plan, you can say that the standard screening is insufficient. Maybe they're proposing something that meets the code, but it's insufficient because there's something else. Maybe a pre-existing senior facility or daycare where, yeah, their screening meets the code, but maybe it's not sufficient
Yeah.
because of the true standards. You can increase those standards. So it does give the planning commission quite a bit of flexibility through a certain set of
Would we
criteria.
have the ability to do that, to preemptively do that, or would it be only if they were coming before us for something else?
The way our general provisions for protection statuses is only if there were a legislative action to be taken, whether that's a site plan or a plat amendment, something where it comes before you. It
Yeah.
wouldn't necessarily be through a compliance or violation issue, or if they were just a conforming or legal non-conforming lot. We couldn't just, the way our code structure is, require that on an undeveloping or unopened property. It has to be,
I mean, like, because if an applicant were seeking an exception, they would come before us seeking the exception.
Mhm.
But how would we look at a site plan, say we want more? Would it just be a recommendation then that we would make to council, or we would put that as a condition of approval?
you'll likely be the land use authority on those site plans. So during the review process, when we bring it to you, you would make it as a condition of approval that we are going to activate this section of
Okay, cool.
the municipal code to require that much,
I was just
that
wondering what the
limited
mechanism
much more.
to get there would be.
Yeah. And if it were, say you have a runaway and you become super overzealous, that applicant, if you approved as a condition of approval that they have to have some crazy substantial amount of screening that it maybe is inadequate, they could appeal that to the appeal authority saying that was an inappropriate use of what the appeal criteria is, or the exception criteria is.
Great.
So there is a checks and balance there. I trust you guys, but of course, we want to make every opportunity for
For holes.
citizens or other commissions, right, to have that check and balance. I think we're good with 5, which I
Our
believe.
zealous tree people.
So that I think concludes this area. The numbers that we've utilized here, we had conferenced about that as a staff a number of times between the canopy trees, the distance. For every 100 linear feet of property line of the subject area, whether that's a boundary area or surrounding areas that is not street frontage, would have that many living plant material units, if we want to call it about that. So if the planning commission wants to talk about the number of plant material units, we can adjust those, but we thought when we spaced those out, and I think as Anna was referencing from other materials, that seemed to be a reasonable requirement to both mitigate, but not also overburden the developer.
Could I see them again? There's just the full numbers.
Yep, just the matrix might be
Yeah, like
easiest.
10 shrubs and
Yeah.
such.
So it basically on the, on the zone boundary buffering, it's 15 plants or 5 trees and 10 shrubs. And then it's 3 trees and 6 shrubs on the boundary. There's a standard buffering, so. And that's per 100 linear feet, so there's a lot.
If I just want to put a fence along for the screening, just right on the property line, do I have to put the trees in?
If you're
Be properly screened. I know, and I'm that's how the code used to be
right,
correctly, right?
right.
And now
So
there's a
under
landscape
this-
Now-
buffer.
Now we're saying there's multiple components where
Need the trees.
Before it
even if
was-
Your screening met some type of.
that keyword was individually or in combination, and it put a lot of the individually elements before that,
Mhm.
which basically said a screen individually can mitigate that, which is what has become an issue for
Got it.
for us in advancing that interpretation. So in this, we're acknowledging we want both and we need both
Nice.
to adequately do that. Now, this standard screening will only apply to those areas where in the code screening is required. This won't be on your average single household, 2 household lots, even 3 household up to 6. So as of the code right now, it's only 7 units or more where you'd have maybe a standard buffering, and then maybe particular commercial uses between commercial uses. So we're going to go through the code, audit that, and pull out some of those standard sections and then reference it back here. But then there are sections like self-storage warehouses, which are permitted uses in C4 and industrial zones, where the buffering is quite robust, over 25 feet with lots of vegetation requirements, lots of screening requirements. So those things will be maintained. This won't override those more direct requirements. This will be anywhere that has basically our previous ordinance would have applied. It'll apply
I'm
here now.
picturing a big commercial building fronting a residential house with like a fence down the middle, but if you look down it, it's just a bunch of use case. I don't know.
Yep. And that's where that zone boundary, that's where that would take
Gravel,
effect.
yeah.
And then likely that zone boundary would be on a portion or multiple portions of multiple properties, but then maybe the standard zoning might pick up on one of the other sides where it's within the commercial district.
How would this apply to, like, we got a handful of condominiums that were in townhouses, they're like shotgun styles that are up across the ballpark.
Mhm.
And then I believe a street over, because they're so slim, they shoot through, something like that wouldn't be allowed, right?
It would be
Same zone as the
It's-
adjacent property.
right. So those are same zone to same zone. So that if the standard requirement applied, they
Yes.
would have to come up with 8 feet of actively used area, meaning the buffer space. So for some of those really narrow lots, they might not have been able to do the
Yeah,
units that they
Because it
did.
is strictly just parking. It's
Or
like a
they'd have to
handful.
really consolidate their development envelope quite a bit, because what they did do is put areas of circulation, areas, not often parking, but multi-use areas, because our current
Circulation.
and previous code permitted that. So it would make it a lot tougher for multi-households in
Interesting.
really narrow situations.
I got it.
So we're making it tougher for developments like that to pencil out then with the new?
Yep. Because before they could manage individually, vertical screening would compensate for the buffering
Yep.
elements. Now we're saying there is a horizontal component to that. And why we've picked 8,
Regardless of zone to zone.
regardless
Yep.
of zone to zone, because this is standard buffering is going to be a use to use type situations, like multi-household to an undefined use. It doesn't matter. It's 8 feet. The reason we picked 8 feet is as we were working with the engineers about the right of way requirements, which Alexi will get to, is that seemed to be the minimum appropriate width to maintain a healthy tree development. And then, along with some other landscaping components. So Kai, where your head is at is some of the struggle that we've gone through of how narrow can we make this, that it's still effective, but also put in the most important element, which at least I believe, which is the tree component along these boundaries. And that 8 foot kind of became that we maintained it at 7 previously, and then working with engineering, we bumped it to 8 because that seemed to be the most appropriate with based off their right of way standards. And sorry, go ahead.
I just don't want to decrease buildable area for like ADUs and stuff.
Well, most of the time though, with the with the buildable areas in the R1, R3, R4 zones, the setback is 7 feet anyway. So it's just 1 foot in addition to what is required by ordinance.
Where it really eats it up though is in those standard developments. You can put
Mhm.
pathways, parking,
Mhm.
circulation all the way up into that fence line. Whereas now we're saying it has to be maintained is purely buffer space. So it's an eat up. It is something to be acknowledged in this. But again, this will only be applying to like 7 or more unit condominiums, not ADUs with single 2 household or 3 to 6 multi-household units. It can apply to more things if you wish, but we're basically saying that standard buffering is only going to be applying to those intense uses that we recognize. Hey, this is substantially different than
Yeah.
what maybe some of the adjacent uses.
And I
or
think based on community feedback, that jives with that. We've had a lot of
Right.
people quite surprised that some of the developments that have gone in the last couple of years felt so close
Mhm.
to the adjacent property.
Mhm.
And I think this might help address that while not like tanking the projects.
Mhm. It will, yeah, it's a balancing act, and that's why we're proposing to you. Does this seem like the correct way to go? Based off all the feedback that we had gotten originally about scaled, this seemed to be the most appropriate
Mhm. Yeah.
fashion, is kind of a two set approach. I've taken up way too much time, but this was good because this had been a long
Yeah,
time
that was
coming to sort this
A
out.
lot of discussion leading up to.
So I think, Alexi, if you're ready, maybe pop it back over to now, jumping into the substantial ordinance of landscaping standards.
Do we want to go through all of it or do we want to skip around to the questions?
I think skipping another question, because the commission should have had time to review this
Yes.
recently, but also this is not too much different framework wise than what you had seen last time we brought it to you.
All right, start with, should plant material be required, and if so, how much? I think this came up before I had been here, and I wanted to revisit it just because I felt like the roots and the plant life had a lot of importance, especially with like storm runoff and some of the other things, reducing erosion, dust, things like that. So I wanted to bring it back and just get a good direction on that. I think the concern before was that plants are costly, or also maybe we don't want to overregulate people. However, I think even a small amount of plant matter would make a difference, and it could be native grasses or other things that wouldn't necessarily have to be costly.
You can go out and pop a couple prickly pears off and pop them in your yard and then meet this requirement and never have to water them. So I think it's a small percentage, and I think and we do clarify that this is not anything on the noxious weeds list. correct?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
that does come up in here. Nothing on the noxious weeds list. is a-
So you can't be, it
Still
can't be like cheat grass.
Uh-huh.
40% of my property is cheat grass. I meet the code.
But it's here in the plant list,
Great.
and we'll get to that. But yes, we do have that.
Does that ring a bell? That because the only reason I want to highlight this in addition to Lexi is it went through water board, plan commission, and city council with all the same result to our consultants, which is to not require a percentage of limb plant material based off that idea that it might be burdening the property owners to a certain degree. We went through that over and over, and the consequence that would yield, I think most people won't do that. They will provide some amount of most people consider live landscaping, not just rock. But if we did not have a number on that, people could essentially put gravel rock down,
Yeah.
and that would qualify on their entire property. And that from our general plan perspective, which is where we felt comfortable, that this is a staff recommendation. It was not part of the original directive, but we felt from a staff perspective, strong enough to reintroduce this as a recommendation in addition to what the original directive was. So where that percentage is, I think, is a good new discussion topic versus yes or no, which is how it was kind of framed originally. So the 15 to 30 would be where we're looking for direction from the commission on. I know that's maybe hard to visualize. Anna had provided materials in the past, kind of showing that of anywhere from, I think, and did 0, which was anywhere from 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, and then 10 to 15, 15 to 20. 30 is a pretty standard. Is that what our
Our
consultants?
consultants were at 25. I think.
25.
Just gonna say 25, yeah.
That was where I leaned, was on the higher end of the 15 to 30 scale, because if simple things like prickly pear or native grasses meet that requirement, then like we said before, it's not really a costly burden. And from an erosion perspective, from a dust control perspective, from a heat perspective, having these living plants is a huge difference over something like gravel. And so I would lean towards 25 to 30 personally.
Yeah, and drain, I think, we talked, God, that was years ago, because I remember Becky was still on the commission, but the original, we don't really care, we don't want to overregulate, which was me that time around, but I think that it was like not wanting to add a list of things for more people to do.
Mhm.
But I think the last couple of years have demonstrated conclusively that it's important to have things that can absorb water. As Luke is like bobbleheading his head off in the back there.
I'm also just inclined to think that, like you said before, people are already going to
Yeah.
put plants and landscaping in. This does not feel like an overreach to me, because I think there are very few people who would want to just gravel all of their landscaping and leave it at that. So for those few people, they may have to suffer through some native grasses or something.
So around 25%, 25 to 30 sounds good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, probably, with the percentage wise, definitely require it. I don't think it would encroach at all. And even if it does, those people are in a completely different world.
Great. Okay, move on to the next one. All right, do we want to require trees in public right of way? And we do have a few things in here about, let me see how much of it I can do on the screen at one time. Essentially, it'd be a tree for every 40 linear feet is how it's proposed right now, which is pretty standard in other ordinances. We would do this because they provide shade, urban heat island effect, reduce dust in the air, absorb sound, absorb CO2. The reason we wouldn't do it is it has a cost. You have to maintain it, which we were discussing earlier. And they would require some kind of irrigation. So they do require water and other like regular maintenance. So right now it's proposed that we would have these trees and there would be a couple ways for people to not plant them if they can't for some reason. One is they could put it on private property. If, for example, there was some reason in the front of their yard, like the sidewalk or something like that, couldn't accommodate it because we wanted to have 8 feet in order to be able to accommodate a tree. So one option would be putting it on private property, which is written in here. And the other is there would be some sort of fee in lieu if it's just not possible. Which also is kind of a parallel question of if we do have these trees for the right of way. And do we want all 3 of those to be equal options or is there some order to them?
Can you, I apologize, can you clarify what you mean by trees in a right of way? What do you mean by right of way?
Yeah,
In this
right of
instance,
way.
I'm thinking like 14 different definitions of right of way here.
Sure, and in this case, a lot of it would be probably like street side, like areas where we have a sidewalk and some sort of like park strips, things like that is the kind of areas that you would probably have trees in the right of way. Do you want to add anything, Corey?
He's drawing.
Just a
Oh,
little
yes.
drawing.
Yes, yeah, he does want to add something.
Sorry, everyone at home. What I'm drawing is your standard frontage. Where that would take place is from center point of the street all the way to your front door, basically. That's what we're considering your frontage here, is that your property line often resides behind the sidewalk somewhere.
Mhm.
So there is oftentimes between the sidewalk and the street or the curb and gutter, a planter strip. That is city right of way, meaning that's actually city property that is kind of from, oh, I'm forgetting the antiquated political policy for this, but the common good of the community is that you're going to take care of the city right of way in your portion of your area. So those planter strips are city owned, meaning those are city trees, but it's maintained by the private property owner for the benefit of the community. So what we're saying is in these right of way strips, we would require a regulatory amount of deciduous trees for all of the reasons that Alexi proposed. Where this is often occurring is because the streets are designated at current capacities. The right of way is often bigger than that or beyond the sidewalk in the case that that arterial route or wherever it is intensifies because of densities and we actually need to expand the street. There's enough room to still have a sidewalk and cover curb, gutter, and width of street. Not to get too intensive with that, but what we're looking at here, and again, the regulations that we worked through with engineering, this really came from engineering. They really wanted to, I don't know what particular meeting Chuck Williams, our city engineer, had followed up with, but following that and understanding our ordinance, he came to petition to us to incorporate this. So it's in line with what our requirements are going towards, other than the fact that we originally had this directive and now we're saying it is for the benefit of the community to require this and it's not that intensive. The standard lot is 50 to 60 feet, meaning if we have for every 40 feet, you required 1 deciduous tree, most lots would only be required to have 1, or 2 trees rather, might be a safe way to say it, an average of 2 trees for your frontage, which like Alexi said, can be either in the right of way strip, on your private property if the right of way strip doesn't work, or a fee in lieu if for whatever reason your property is encumbered in a way that it just can't sustain any trees.
This is the
Healthy
only
life.
if there's a right of way strip
Yes, it would only be if there is right of way.
Okay.
On your.
on a
or, like,
public,
through-
on a public street.
Yeah, if you're on a private street within a private development, this would not
Yeah.
apply. So this is when we're thinking about our large width streets, and usually there are trees lining those streets. As a property were to come and develop, they'd be responsible for either replacing or installing the trees that would go on their section of that right of way. So if you've ever been up to the Wasatch and Salt Lake communities, that's generically how those were all developed.
What does that mean for streets that aren't wide? Like, I'm thinking like Park Drive area.
Exactly. So if there is no park strip next to the right of way, because the right of way is so small,
Mhm.
but it is a city right of way and would qualify for this, you would be allowed to place those on your private property front, meaning in the front yard somewhere, place that 1 or 2 trees on your property that you're maintaining. So it is to your full benefit, but also what we're trying to reduce, as Alexi pointed out, is reductions of CO2, canopy, heat island effect, all those benefits that trees provide.
And is that also for like single family residential, or is it just for subdivision or major developments?
It'd be anywhere there's a right of way.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Anywhere
a
there's a
lot of
sidewalk.
people would appreciate trees in their neighborhood, but there's also sort of this question of where, like, does it have to be in the right of way, or are there other like private property fee and lieu? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just wherever there's a sidewalk. So would that also mean most people are legal non-conforming, or most people have trees on their, they already have one in their yard, so it really wouldn't change much.
Correct.
It would just make it so that if you have a new development and you're putting, you have to make sure there's a tree.
Right. And kind of, I mean, again, back to how Miles is framing this is a lot of these provisions are already be done. We're just creating these minimum thresholds in the weird scenarios that properties come up and they don't apply any of these kind of more standard regional effects. There's at least a minimum threshold. So most people are often providing at least this, if not more.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, whenever the
Not
code
everyone,
comes
of
up.
course. I don't want to write people off that may feel this is somewhat burdensome, but that's where we've been directed to go, of saying we need to analyze this and maybe.
So we're
propose
saying
something
that
more
you
aggressive.
have to have trees in the front of your house.
Yep.
Whether or not you want trees on the front of your house.
Potentially. I
don't
mean,
know how I
if you're on
feel
the
about
right of
that.
way, and then the other thing is that, kind of the follow-up question to this is if we do that, are all 3 options viable from the beginning? You can say, I want to pay a fee in lieu, I don't want a tree.
Mhm.
Or is that only if you cannot accommodate it, then you can move on to the next step? So there would be an option for saying you could have all 3 be parallel and you're like, I don't want a tree, plant one in a park, here's your money.
I will also add is that this whole chapter is going to have an exceptions section. Within that, it's going to hit that double category of where they apply to the Plan Commission for discretionary approval. I'm guessing that we're probably going to even add a public hearing element to that. So if somebody says I don't want to do it, or it wasn't in my plan set and I can't afford it, or even afford the fee in lieu, they can petition to you and you can determine a reasonable through criteria analysis of if it should be accepted for a particular reason. But generally speaking, this is I know we're adding plant material, but that's a standard regionally.
Yeah.
One of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about this was the mention of it having to be a deciduous tree specifically, whereas like there are options for coniferous trees or other things that would provide a lot of the same result, but I would be inclined to give people a little bit more leeway with what they're actually planting in their yard, but hope that it would be something that is water conscious and that provided that same shade or otherwise, but it doesn't have to be like a mulberry or one of the more like common deciduous trees in the area. They could branch out to a variety of like willows and other stuff like that that could be slightly more water conscious and provide similar effect and give people a little bit more leeway on what's in their yard and what's in front of their yard, when still achieve the result we want, which is, some nice vegetation on the city right away.
I think that's a good comment to take in. I do want to also piggyback onto that. The engineers was already anticipating having a set standard of breadth of trees based on their root systems. Certain root systems are not appropriate for that very reason. They break sidewalks or horizontal spreading.
True. Yeah.
So
I was gonna say, what does Public Works think about this?
they were part of the ones that were like,
Okay,
we
cool. It's
want
the ones
this.
that inevitably have to maintain said right of ways and trees.
Yeah, so that's part of it, is that the trees themselves have to make sense for where they're at. And if we want to think about it on a larger community scope, what we're doing with the buffering requirement is similar to what we're doing here, is that there's an expanse. So in private developments, we have a 15% landscaping requirement for parking lots to break up those asphalt heat island effects. we're kind of looking at this as the common heat island effect of roadways. So each individual development is going to contribute to its coverage of canopy coverage, trying to reduce that heat island effect of streets and just even their yard systems and sidewalks.
I'm a big fan of it. Yeah, I was just thinking of a trip that I made to Sacramento when you can walk down the streets and it's just massive trees that cover, from side to side. And of course, we're not going to get that same effect here in Moab. It need nothing close, but it is still extremely nice to see. And I enjoy walking down a sidewalk, and then when there's that like blip of openness, it's like, where'd my shade go?
Mhm.
No, I like it. I'm a big fan. I don't see it as a problem.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No.
I think we want to take Miles' comment down.
Yes.
About the deciduous trees.
Yeah, that they're, because it is so specified here, we were gonna work with engineers within our plant list and qualify certain species for canopy trees, which we're gonna define out
Mhm.
for the buffering requirement. It may be appropriate that we're doing a similar type designation for right-of-way trees.
Yeah, or in
Mhm.
general, just having like a list of recommended or allowable, trees or vegetation that people could choose from. And if they wanted to plant something different, they could petition us or otherwise, but they would have something to work from, and we could kind of, you talk about a beautiful canopy of trees when you're walking down the sidewalk, but that also, I think about how much water that beautiful canopy of
Mhm.
trees consumes.
Mhm.
And so if we kind of lead people to plant water conscious plants that are still going to help with the heat island effect and everything else, but that, aren't massively water consuming, plants, then I think that would really, like, for us, that makes a lot of sense going forwards.
Desert willows for all.
It is, that is the
Yeah.
challenge,
Mhm.
particularly with this component of the ordinance and what we were talking about screening buffering, of where everywhere else we're almost paring down how to be water efficient within our landscaping ordinance. And these are the areas where we're actually building up
Scaling up.
Yep.
the need for water. We've talked about similar to like a dark sky scenario where maybe that buffering requirement, does that eat up your whole water budget and then you can't landscape everything else in the interior? Which is why we're going to have some of these exception materials built in, is that if there's a weird scenario where that happens, we can
But
handle those effects.
Guiding people towards desert willows and junipers and things like that versus
Mhm,
mulberries and, all those other
mhm,
heavy water use trees that are still technically native plants, but
mhm.
really only exist in riparian zones rather than all over.
I think here's where you lose me on this, the irrigation requirement. I
Mhm.
think that's pretty massive for a residential development or a single family residential home.
Mhm.
Requiring irrigating a tree on a city right of way
Mhm.
it's a pretty heavy lift, particularly if you weren't planning on putting in-ground irrigation in, or you don't have it already. That's becomes really complicated really quickly. Crossing the sidewalk becomes really complicated really quickly to irrigate. And so I'm wondering
Mhm.
how just logistically that might work for some properties.
I think that's a good point. I think it would make sense for us to put in something about, because we have a plant list with, okay, going to the deciduous part, right now, it's if you have enough trees to have 75%. So you can put whatever you want in if you have fewer than 4 trees as it is right now. So at that point, we could say like, there's non-irrigated or very low water use trees. So we could say, pick a low water, non-irrigated, whatever tree, and then you have to maintain it, but you don't have to irrigate it. But if you're going to plant a high water tree, something like that, we could either not make them irrigate anything, or I think the concern is that the trees are going to die.
I understand that.
We could just maybe make a specification that if you choose one of these low water trees, you don't have to irrigate it because they don't need it.
Yeah, I just think asking people to provide irrigation, water and infrastructure to property that is not their own makes me uncomfortable, honestly. As a low income homeowner myself, that would be a huge lift. If I had that on my property where I don't have in-ground irrigation in the front yard. So
Yeah, just the initial expense of installing irrigation or something like that.
it's
Is
ridiculous.
Massive.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from the expense of the trees themselves.
And all of those trees are gonna require a significant amount of water to get established in the first place. So I think if you're requiring trees, you're inherently requiring people to use a bunch of water at some point or another, which is why I'd be more inclined to have like a or shrubs thing, because like you could, you know, put some Russian sage in and it'll be fine and you don't even have to look at it ever again, but it'll provide pollinator habitat and species and some ground cover and also some soil fixing.
Well, and like just looking
elements.
at this list of non-irrigated trees, a lot of those fall well within something that could be planted, could still be seen as a tree and provide more cover than something like Russian sage.
Yeah,
But would not require irrigation. So some type of like maintenance requirement where if you choose a big deciduous tree that's going to consume a lot of water, that you are expected to establish it appropriately, and whether or not that's you standing out in your yard with a hose every morning and evening, or whether that's you irrigating it, that's not really the city's problem as long as the tree is maintained properly.
I just don't want people thinking they're gonna establish a bristlecone pine in the right of way.
Yeah, they're going to
Like,
have a heck of a
looking
time
at
with
this
that one. Yeah.
list, like, no. I think that's really it. I think that's the line for me, is that like, I understand completely trying to help maintain existing plant life and plant material, but there's something about that, and maybe this isn't something that would apply a whole bunch of places. In the first place, there's a lot of places in town where there's no sidewalk, so there's no right of way, or there's trees already somewhere, but yeah. I don't know.
Also, do we want to strike irrigation or put it in such that if you have an existing tree or a non-irrigated variety or something like that, do you want to take it out entirely and just say maintain it? We don't care how.
It's all gonna come to you guys, so your perspective now is helpful.
Like, my thoughts on this is particularly if somebody is making the decision of bringing in like a high water use tree, like I think since we are trying to be much more water wise as a community and everything, like there has to be a bit of a balancing act. And so to me, the added cost of potentially requiring irrigation like adds a little bit more consideration to that calculus that kind of forces people to take into consideration just like not just like the monetary costs of like the water that are associated with trying to keep this tree alive, but to a certain degree like the social costs associated with it as well. So I see some value to it. I do really like the idea of just kind of having that list of like trees to pick from, and ideally kind of gently nudging or incentivizing people to select those things. And I think it kind of like falls in line with some of the feedback from like developers that we've gotten, where it helps for them to not have this just like broadly defined concept that they have to figure out like, does this work within this or whatever, but like they still have a list of choices and options that they could pick from, but like they know with certainty that like they are meeting the requirements and there's no like doubting it. But like I struggle with it too, because I was fortunate enough to like have some assistance with like the cost of my irrigation, and it was like a really big expense, and that's not something that like a lot of people potentially take into consideration like right off the bat. Like that to me is kind of like one of those things that you start considering like towards the end of like the finishing of like a project, and it's a big cost to have to try to squeeze in like last minute. But yeah, I kind of see it more so as for new developments, like you're bringing this new thing in, it's going to be this new like strain on the local resources, and so like there has to me like I think just adding more to that consideration process that has value to it.
That concept could be incorporated here, where this application is applying to a certain level landscaping plan. So a
Yeah.
level, like we say 2 or 3 versus a 1, which is what we've kind of attributed to the larger, or excuse me, the smaller scale or individual style developments, versus now you're at a level 1 site plan or a level 2 site plan, which would mean you have a level 2 landscaping plan or a level 3 landscaping plan, which is often you're developing at a large scale, where that cost ratio isn't going to be contemplated at this level that we're talking about. So that, if we, again, I think where Kai is at is some level of philosophical opposition. And then I think Luke's coming from is kind of the practical component of where that implementation is.
And I will agree with Luke. I like the idea of essentially using the cost of irrigation as a way to guide people towards the more water conscious plants in the first place. But I do tend to side with Kaya in the sense that somebody should have the option of picking a plant from an approved list and not having to pay for the cost of irrigating that plant.
Which I
I,
think
I absolutely, as someone who goes around, spends my late summer and fall picking goat heads out of city right of ways, I am fully supportive of landscaping those right of ways. You lose me at trees. That's it. That's
Mhm.
really just requiring trees. I think there's so many other ways to landscape that maybe aren't the water usage, the cost, even though I do fall more on the side of like trees are a net benefit for our water table for water retention and drainage and like aquifer recharge. So I don't see it as a net drain on water to have more trees. But at the same time, it's, you know, the upkeep, the intensity of it. I 100% want to see every single right of way, park strip, everything with stuff growing in it. I just don't know that it should have to be trees in all instances.
And kind of with that in mind, if something does go wrong, it's a lot easier to replace non-trees than trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just the initial expense for, you know, common homeowner picking up a few things of Russian sage or something like that is far less than planting a significantly sized tree.
Even a small one, a juniper is like $100.
Yep.
A small one.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And for something that's actually going to shade the street, like within a couple of years of planting, you're going to spend a good bit more than $100 on that tree.
Yeah, I definitely think it's something that we should research more. It's kind of hard to do this without an expert on staff, like an
Yeah.
urban forester or something like that, because I do know like street trees are neighborhood defining. They also help with the urban heat island
Absolutely,
effect.
absolutely.
They hurt with, you know, they help with a lot of things. So it's a really good incentive. But it's kind of hard without a little bit more research, what exactly is the best, or an expert on hand, what the right path to go is on this, I think. And as far as irrigation goes, I had, you know, I had a street tree that was planted for me by the city I lived in. And all I did was put a hose in it and water it for like 15 minutes every week. And I mean, it wasn't for me, that wasn't a big deal, but
I guess for what it's worth, my understanding of the definition of irrigation is something that's installed and like operational on its own. Whereas like running the hose over, I wouldn't consider that irrigation. I'd consider that like manual watering or something like that. And so like the expense of installing irrigation, that's why I see that as expensive, because you're right, dragging a hose to the tree, not a problem.
yeah.
But installing drip or something like that is more.
This will be good. I don't think I'm going to capture all of the notes from this whole situation, but there are elements where I think we can come back. We're still going to probably propose it to you in different fashions.
Yeah.
One of those being maybe we strike irrigation and then it's just housed under that landscaping maintenance component that
Yeah.
if you let that tree die, that is your
Do
obligation.
something with it, yeah.
Yeah.
But we're not going to regulate having you cut into the sidewalk with a automated irrigated buried system.
Yeah.
the important part here is the maintenance of that tree.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Agree.
Has the city brought in that arborist that's like new to town that can be voluntary?
There's a couple of arborists who are talking to Annie about parks who work in town and they're just volunteering. But we could maybe consult one of them about street trees and what's required to maintain them.
The term street trees. They're tough. They've been hardened. They've had a difficult life.
Hard not.
Sorry.
That's dumb.
I'm with you today, guys. Yeah, and again, if it ultimately, it's whatever council decides that is something that they're gonna be psyched about.
Mhm.
But I think hopefully this discussion kind of captures so relay it. Yeah, right?
Like, okay, so we can work on mitigation and talk to an arborist about what it requires, like, we can get to, new trees. And then
And also species list too, I would think,
I
like
think
what
we can
would
go
be.
through, right,
Mm.
talk to our consultants too about like our current
Yeah.
net list and which things are appropriate for that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Um,
Not fruiting mulberries.
it'd also be nice maybe to like do some type of survey, a survey eventually and identify tree species that, add to a community or to the character of a neighborhood or something like that, and kind of put those more on the priority list eventually. I know that's kind of advanced for us right now, but maybe eventually doing something like that so we can have like have street trees as character defining for neighborhoods as well.
And I
So-
think tools like that will help developers and help people working on their own properties. If you give them a list of approved trees and they understand, these are my low water use, I don't have to do irrigation. These are my high water use, I have to. But we can still kind of lead people away from the worst. Of course, prohibit like noxious ones, and those kind of tools will help people be more okay with like, ordinances like this where they're gonna have to do something on their property. At least if you make it easy for them, it's a little bit easier to chew.
In that vein, oh, go
You might be getting where I'm getting at
ahead.
of the required plan list versus recommended. And
Not
some,
quite. I was gonna
okay.
ask about the fee and lieu private property right of way question. Should they all be equal on the table, or having it in a yard, right? The benefits come to the neighborhood that it is in, as opposed to across town in a park or
Yeah.
something like that. However, maximum flexibility is to give people all options and say, do what you want. So do you have any?
I'd like to make what we want more doable, so that that's chosen. I think that was something like with the Wahoo, like everyone did fee and lieu because the other things didn't really make a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So if we actually have something, I want to make it feasible, so that the fee and lieu is like the very rare, there's no possible way I can do this for whatever extenuating circumstances that we didn't contemplate right now. Yeah,
The one thing that would mitigate like fee and lieu would just having the resource to be able to choose from everything.
well, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's,
I think make meeting the requirements as straightforward as possible for all possible property owners. And then you won't get, and certainly across the board, you would have you would have larger developers who are financially more set up to actually meet the requirements, to take the fee and lieu option. So I don't think it should apply across the board.
I'll agree with that, because the three options were like comply or plant them on your property if you don't have enough space in the right of way, or do the fee and lieu. And I think like the first two are pretty reasonable, and some definition of how far into your property already applies, because plenty of people already have trees in their front yard. And if they're close enough to the right of way, why shouldn't that already just be compliance and be fine? So some definition of that, I would lean towards those two options being equal. And then fee and lieu if there's like genuine reasons why they couldn't comply. But yeah, I'm with Kai. I think a lot of developers, if the fee and lieu is reasonable enough, would just pay it out and not go through the hassle.
Well, I do want to put the caveat that it's a discretionary action on you. So if you can,
Yeah.
upon the presentation, they say, well, we just really don't want to, so we're going to pay it out. You could say, no, this is for the community benefit. We need you to do this.
Mhm.
They will have to do that in order
It's
to
not just
approve their
a-
application.
It's not just pick one of these.
Yeah,
options,
it's a criteria basis that you'd say if they're not,
Yeah.
that you have to make, well, the burden of proof, but also showing that there is burden at all.
Mhm.
So when we're talking large scale developers just paying out, I don't see that as a viable option for fee and lieu. The fee and lieu is going to come from somebody that says, it literally because of either my lot situation or means cannot do this. It would have to show that evidence to you guys.
Right.
So,
Well, right, as it's written right now, if you have a tree already or plant one in 16 or 12, depending on where your sidewalk is, it would count. So does that,
Okay,
even if
16
we
or
fix
12
the other
feet back.
things, yeah, from the front of
Yeah,
that.
and that sounds pretty reasonable, because plenty of people who would otherwise need to plant trees in the right of way would already have a tree in their front yard that would comply.
Yeah. I'm almost more concerned about what we don't want in the right of way than what we do. I will say, just like looking at all the right of ways around town, if there was a proactive requirement to not allow elms to germinate in the right of way, that'd be awesome.
Are elms defined as noxious?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they should be.
And they're really.
At least in my house, they are.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But I do see a lot of, elms, tree of heaven, that kind of thing growing in city
Yeah.
right of ways that needs to be taken care of one way or another.
And that's, I mean, talk about community benefit. It's like the expense, cost and effort to get it out when it's been there a year versus 2 or 3 is like
Mhm.
wild.
Mhm.
I mean, look at every like empty property that's maybe someone's contemplated developing but hasn't yet. They cut all the elms down and they're all back a year
Mhm.
later.
They don't just go away.
No.
They are a process.
No. Okay.
Cool.
I'm
Thank you.
think some trees. Do we want to revisit the artificial plants or we just want to skip to the plant list?
Artificial plants are weird.
Didn't we already talk about that?
We did, then Corey, because we did it when we were talking about screening.
We
So
tabled it.
Corey's like, oh,
Let's
we could
just-
kind of.
Let's just stew on it a little bit and then come back.
I'm,
to
I
where
mean,
we
I'm
land.
inclined to go with what. So I know y'all have thought about this a lot more than we have, and
This is one where I think the council's
Yep.
opinion is going to be
Yep.
pretty significant.
Yeah.
Especially
you
given
can
the
you call
adminis-
Ronnie and ask her what she thinks?
Yeah, the administrative take on this right now is to prohibit. I
That's
think at
where it came from.
Yeah.
lower staff level, we kind of have similar reactions. Well, there are places where it would maybe
Mm-hmm.
appropriate, but ultimately do the cons outweigh some of those potential opportunities as more of a health safety issue than it would be a viability benefit.
I was curious to just simply do more research. I don't know if there is one type of artificial plant or artificial like turf per se that is safer than others. I mean, artificial turf's been around for a long time and we've gone a long way from that like green golf grass. I've seen some of it look like darn near real. And so I'm just curious if any of those, or if there's a particular material that certain artificial turf is made out of that is like significantly more environmentally friendly than others. So if we were going to allow a plastic that doesn't break down into at least harmful chemicals or otherwise, microplastics are something we will never get away from if we're going to have plastic out in the UV, but it breaking down and then allowing other chemicals along with those microplastics into the water table would be, in my opinion, a bigger concern than one that doesn't do it as much. If there
Mhm.
is a significant difference between the two, maybe we could allow one and not the other just based off of the actual like environmental feasibility of it. And I looked at it for 30 seconds online and
You
there's
just
a
stay
wealth
at
of
the table.
information. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I actually randomly ran across an article, I think within this past week, that pointed to the fact that bicycle tires are one of the largest contributors of microplastics in my kind of residential areas.
Oh, well, we're screwed then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's bicycles and just basically like rubber tires. So anytime that you have rubber tires that are kind of rubby, there's going to be like the wearing down of tires like results in like the release of microplastics. And so kind of thinking that we have this giant bike population along with like the off-roading and everything, we have a lot of microplastic creation in our community as is.
Potato salad hill contribution from this last weekend alone.
Alone.
Yeah, it's not something I'd ever thought of, and as soon as I saw it.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Interesting. I feel like as it's written, I think artificial, so I'm thinking like those little like corrugated metal cacti and agave sculptures. A strict reading of this would prohibit those because those are artificial plants.
Mhm.
So I want to make sure we're saying like, flat, like,
Totally. That's a great
Plastic.
observation.
because I love those little metal sculptures.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I hope to
Yeah.
afford one someday. They're really expensive. But
They're lawn ornaments.
Yeah.
Specifying plastic.
Yeah, I think specifying like, you know, petrochemical
Mhm.
stuff.
Well, and this is kind of why I wonder about turf. Like, I wonder, you know, we do have biodegradable plastics and there have been big advancements in plastics in general. So I wonder if somebody makes turf out of one that biodegrades into something more reasonable than, you know, a regular like.
I think that,
So if we. this is
oh
what-
yeah,
this is what
WRI
our
did a,
gave us. I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but basically they were advising overall against it. I can also research it more and talk to our consultants about it.
I think the active recreation, like prescription probably covers it. Honestly, it's keeping it from being absolutely everywhere all the time, but is still allowing it for it has a place.
Mhm.
And you're not saying you can't have artificial turf in your backyard for your kid who wants to practice soccer, you know, like it's,
That's a distinction we'd have to make further, because right
Mhm.
now outdoor recreation is a defined use category like a ball field or a soccer field that is a use parameter, not a component.
I was just
of
gonna say,
use.
okay, so my next question was, what is the current definition of active recreation
Mhm.
area?
Mhm.
But I like it. I mean, so I see it as like, you know, you have a cute little patio fire pit area. A lot of people are using artificial turf now in lieu of gravel or a patio paved surface for their little like hangout nook in the backyard. And it's essentially a rug when you think about it that way. And I would hate to say like, oh, you can't have a 4x8 like rug of artificial turf just
Wonder if
because,
we
and
could
I'm
put-
also wondering like, okay, so that the woven plastic outdoor rug that I have
Mhm.
is probably contributing just as much microplastic as the turf is, but we're not specifically prohibiting that.
I
Or
wonder
we
if we
could-
could put like a maximum on it outside of an active, like outside of a currently defined active recreation area, that like if it's a ball field, you can have it. Or if it's in your backyard, you can have blank square feet of it,
Mm.
you know, for your little hangout nook or whatever. But you can't turf your entire yard just because you don't want to have a lawn and you
Yeah.
don't want to have gravel.
Something like that.
Maybe you do something like in the required landscaped yards, not having the artificial plants, and then like in the rear yard or whatever, where there is the landscape requirement, you can have the artificial.
Yeah, it doesn't
birds and
count
that kind
towards
of
your
stuff.
landscaping
Yeah.
requirement. I think that makes sense.
I also think making a distinction between something like turf that like does replace a lawn, lawns are high water use, so turf makes some sense, to like other ornamental plastic plants in your yard that are breaking down and like serve very little purpose. To me, why not plant a grass or a cactus that you don't have to water, that doesn't break down into plastics, like then have a like fake ficus or something in your yard, you know? I would be inclined to make a distinction there, and like turf has its place because it replaces a lawn, but something that replaces just what could be an otherwise basically maintenance-free shrub, I wouldn't want to allow those along with turf if we were going to allow turf. Because I could see people, you know, not being interested in doing any like landscaping maintenance, so putting up plastic plants, but you know, making sure we're not allowing ones that are basically pointless.
So what I've got is look up things that might be less harmful versions, make sure we're not outlawing sculptures, and possibly putting in some sort of allowable size and exclude it from landscape required, like your required landscape area. That can capture.
Yes.
All right, the next thing on our list is, oh, actually, okay, so the patches of grass gets a little at the rug thing. Right now, we have the 8x8 foot requirement for putting turf, cool season, specifically cool season turf. What that is meant to do is to make sure people have a size of turf that they can efficiently irrigate in some way. However, what it also does is it means you couldn't have a 4x4 square of grass that your dog uses. Any thoughts on that? I mean, we could specify only if you're artificially irrigating it, or that there's an exception if you're hand irrigating, something like that. However, a lot of things that you might figure out, like a sprinkler can't do 8x8 efficiently. I mean, you can't do something small efficiently.
Sure.
So. And also it only applies to cool season turfs. So this is not if you're planting warm season grasses, it's not included.
Oh. That's pretty significant. It's a big change.
Would be helpful to see the definitions of cool and warm season turf grasses.
I have it in my brain. You've got like basically Kentucky bluegrass and fescues versus buffalo grass and
Yep.
blue grandma and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking 10% of total landscaped area or 200 square feet of turf, whichever is greater.
And this came out of, I think, the large development. Is that where the
Mm-hmm.
concern is about it?
Mhm.
This exists in a large development piece of like
Mm-hmm.
it might extend it to everything. However, there are some exceptions for this as we get later in terms of different levels of plants and water budgets. So what this would do effectively is only if you are on a prescriptive option at a level 1, which would be like getting a building permit for some reason. If you were on the prescriptive option of the first level, this would apply to you, but it doesn't apply to people with water budgets in level 1 or level 2. I think level 3 would bring it back again. I'm not positive.
Sure.
We can go down there. But
I'd have to think more on that.
This is ultimately, again, a council thing, I think.
I think some of these others are basically are they allowed or not, and then we'll get into the different levels of plans and what's required from each one. So mulch, essentially required any amount of mulch. We did create this in such a way that you could get out of mulching if all of your plants were native, because native plants don't necessarily need it. And I think it's a piece of advice that our consultants got and suggested putting in. But we would do mulch because it helps minimize dust. It also helps soil moisture. Not in case of massive flooding, but just rain.
I love mulch.
I like that. I'm in favor of the mulch. It's a
Love it. It's great.
good way to support your
A
soil.
mulch. Our water features are allowed. Right now, we do allow them, and we just have some restrictions on them. Like we are covering that and shut off the device, you should recirculate your water and whatever kind of water feature you want, and you have a water budget. So this week with water budgets, it just counts as like a high water area. That's how it is now. Some cities don't allow them, but they can allow pools, like hot tubs,
Pools and hot
not
tubs.
anything else. Other types of water features would be allowed, which is very certain factors.
They're currently only allowed during with a budget.
Right now, you'd have to have a budget, and then you would put it in the high water zone. And so we figured that gave people the most flexibility, and it didn't create an issue where somebody already had something installed and then decide that they want to get a building permit, and now they have to take out the bathroom.
I think that's fairly reasonable.
I like how it stands.
Well, I don't feel that water features are super appropriate in the desert. I, understand that that's my opinion, not to completely enforceable.
I'm thinking about a current water pond with the fountain that my dad had built in his backyard like a decade ago that we just tore apart because he's like, yeah, we don't need this. This is silly.
Grandparents had one, they loved it.
Okay, I'll leave it as is. and then
Sorry.
Do you want to
Best
get into
Western.
the water sense features or just want to?
I think we should.
Yeah, I have gotten some community feedback about that.
That's helpful.
So, council member suggested that there's water sense features inside as well as outside. Right now, this is just for information. And it has been done, but more like general water conservation ordinances, like Washington County, St. George area. So. wanted to get feedback.
I like the idea of requiring water sense fixtures. I think they're great. I think I got free ones from Rocky Mountain Power like 4 years ago. They were just giving them out if you just filled out a form on the internet. I know that's probably not the case anymore, but they're not that hard to come by. I just don't know that this is the place for it. And that was my response to someone who had asked this, who I think maybe had talked to the council member who was curious about if we're looking at water conservation, shouldn't we have indoor requirements as well as outdoor? And yes, but I think that's a bigger can of worms, and I like bifurcating things for that reason, where we can have the landscaping now, but then I think proactively making a point to also address indoor soon is really good. Maybe not just in the context of redevelopment or development standards, like we're working on editing for some zones, like commercial OAs, that kind of stuff. I know it's been discussed in that context. And I don't think it would have to be as comprehensive as this whole landscaping, multiple additional chapters of the code are. I think it'd be easy to add just to our.
I also think there's a chance we could bite off like a smaller chunk of that, in the sense that I think like you said from Rocky Mountain Power, they gave you, fixtures, that there's ways we can incentivize people aside from this to get them to use more water sense features. But I also like dealing with people's homes and different things, like certain fixtures like water sense shower heads or something like that. That could be a big sticking point. A lot of people spend a lot of good money to have their, particular, bathroom fixtures, their particular faucets, shower heads, or otherwise. But one item I see that most people don't have a strong stylistic opinion on that could save us a lot of water is the toilets. Incentivizing people to put in low flow toilets. That is not something that people often have a strong opinion on. And it is something that we could require in new developments that would not step on any designer's toes, but would help reduce the amount of water we use.
Big time.
Full point.
Yeah, you would know about
Oh.
everyone's fixtures in their houses.
Yeah.
Well.
Your Aaron.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I'm here to handle it separately, but we go to like
I think actually actively pursue it. Because I agree. I think it, yeah, like you said, doesn't make sense if you have people whose toilets are running all day long in the house. But it's like, well, you've got a water budget for your sagebrush outside, like.
Okay, pursue it, but pursue it separately from,
Landscaping.
okay. The next thing is middle levels. All right, I'm gonna do my best to explain this and then we'll answer questions. So there are 3 different levels of landscaping plans. The lowest level is what a lot of like homeowners might need, like a building permit. And then they're kind of an increasing level of development. So redevelopment improvements, and the idea is splitting these out and then getting to more intensive use in level 3. So we split them out because we figured people in level 2s and 3s might have landscape architects who can do a little bit more in terms of landscaping, officially irrigation, hydrozoning, creating water budgets. So for level one, there's two options. 1 through 5 to be prescriptive, so they would do things that are on the 5 list. Or they could do number 7, and people at the level 1 do not have to have the irrigation system. So that's the benefit. So they could go completely prescriptive, or they could get creative with a water budget, but they wouldn't have to do both. So they have the most flexibility. In level 2, people would, since they have a water budget, they wouldn't have to be on a plant list, and they could the season turf limits depending on what their water budget looked like. And level 3, my understanding is that we go back to adding full season turf limits because these are really large developments and we can handle it. Okay, so there are a few things that aren't in here, which are notable, which is whatever we decide on artificial plants are not in here, and tree requirements are not in here, and the minimum plant material requirement is not in here because we figured you had to do that no matter what. Like you can't create a water budget and say I have 0 plants and 0 on my water budget. Good job. So those things are not in here. We've had a lot of discussions about who has to do what. So on what you think about who should have to meet those requirements.
Can you give just for us and for the viewers at home, can you give an example of what a 1, a 2, and a 3 might be? What kind of thing people would be looking at there?
Right. The reason we chose this framework is it's based off our existing approval
Totally.
structures.
Yep.
So a level 1 is going to be anything that is within a building permit context. So if you're coming in, whether it's commercial development, commercial redevelopment, or residential development, essentially there are different metrics within that, but generally speaking, if you're under 2,000 square feet of new development, or if it's a permitted use like a single household, 2-household structure, that's just a building permit. If you're into a multi-household structure over a certain amount of units or square footages, that's when you're getting into your level 1s or level 2s. And then commercial developments, remodels under a certain size are usually just level 1s. Some can just be through building permits. So it is hard to generically say this type of development's only going to ever be this. But broadly speaking, the level 1 landscaping plan is going to be your neighborhood style developments. Your level 2s are going to be your large neighborhood style developments and very low level commercials. And then your level 3 landscaping is going to be like your massive apartment and condominium projects, and then your commercial projects.
And one of the specific questions we had with this is our plant list, which we referenced earlier, that we had a lot of discussions about whether it is recommended or required.
For them to provide a plant list.
We do have a plant list. We can add to the plant list. We can do different things with it, but it kind of depends on whether it's a required plant list. Right now, we're only requiring people on the prescriptive level of 1 to do the plant list, or whether it's recommended for everybody. Like we suggest you choose off this list, but you don't have to.
Okay, so I think with the wording, to me, this reads, should the city be given a copy of the plant list from the applicant? Not, should the applicant be required to have plants off the plant list? So I think some clarification in just the wording, because it says, should the plant list be required? To me, that means I have to hand you a list of the plants I'm planning to use as someone who's planning to do who needs a level 1 site plan. And it sounds like that's not what you're contemplating.
These are referencing the general standards. So the plant list is the general standard plant list, and then the full season turf limits is the general standard turf limits. But we could put in more description at the beginning, saying like making sure that it's clear that each of these corresponds to a general standard that you would follow, not a list of things you need to submit.
Yeah.
I don't mind the idea of requiring people to work off the plant list or seek an exception rather than the other way around. Or possibly just out of the total amount of plants you have in your landscaping, that a certain number of them or a certain percentage of them comes off the plant list, because we are guiding that plant list to be water friendly, native or, plants that we would like to see in the community. So I'd be inclined to ask them to work off it, and then if they want something else, to seek an exception.
And the water budget itself helps with that bit
Mhm.
anyways. So it's
Yeah.
not like people are going to come with a list of plants that are, outrageous. They do still have to stick to something.
Mhm.
So if that's the case, I don't think I understand why the plant list isn't included in all of the levels.
We wanted to give people more flexibility. And then there are some other issues that come up with this plant list. So
Just not exhaustive.
so here's
Yeah.
right plant list, and this is, I viewed one of our recent plans on like whether the things that are proposing were in a plant list or not. And these are the things that are on their design but weren't on our draft plant list, right? So in this case, right, the issue with the water budget people having to follow our plant list is that unless our plant list is comprehensive,
Mhm.
they could easily request things that aren't on it that are okay, but we just
Totally.
get kind of got creative. We were thinking prescriptive option, it at least gave people some definition, and then it also limited what you would put in because you don't have a water budget at that level. One of the problems Anna and I were discussing though is that it would create an issue if you wanted to build a permit for some reason on your property and you have bulbs or annuals or something else that's not on our plant list. Like, do we want to tell people they have to rip out like your grandmother's iris?
Well, I feel like that could just be adjusted by applying the plant list at different levels. Like,
Yeah.
at a building permit level, at the level 1 you guys are talking about, you're right. Plenty of people plant things in their yards. Plenty of people have bulbs planted by their grandma, and it is very hard to have an exhaustive list of approved plants. But I think when it comes to doing large redevelopments or any small or bigger development where somebody is like really starting with a clean slate, so to speak, that's the point where it's really important to guide them towards the kind of plants we want to see in our community, because at that point they're not having to rip up grandma's irises. They're already, they've already been torn up, or they're doing a massive remodel. So then we're just saying, hey, like, here's these water friendly plants. And again, with, the exception that they could come forward and be like, hey, we thought of these things. They are, still plants we want to see in the community. They're just not on your list. We can work with that. But I think it's important to remember that as much as we talk about what the water usage of the plants, there are also plenty of other issues with plants that may be water friendly, but that are not friendly to the local flora and fauna. And so making sure that people understand that it's not just about budgeting water, it's about, using native species that are good for our whole, biome rather than just water friendly plants.
Can we say the plant list excluding annuals?
We could say
Yeah.
excluding annuals, or we could say including bulbs, or we could say.
I like that
excluding a certain
honestly,
amount of
because
space.
you know what I never have to water in my yard? My bulbs.
Mhm.
Ever.
Yeah. They'll come up every year.
Ever. They come up, they come back. I don't do anything. They're pretty.
They also
Um,
don't spread and propagate really
Yeah.
poorly. They don't, you don't see
Yeah.
them.
I think honestly that I think I worry more about the things that are going to persist that are not so seasonal. And I think most people honestly having a plant list is really great. I think people probably will appreciate it. Like the number of people who like walk up to Wild Landscapes who just moved here, like, I don't know what to do. We'll just show them the list now. It's great.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think maybe you not allowing annuals, common annuals, or just annuals in general, I think would fundamentally change the character of town. Because I think a lot of the spring blooms, the summer blooms, the decorative things, the things that we have on city properties and along Main Street, those are all annuals. So I do think just excluding those as a matter of course probably makes good sense. And those aren't the main water users either.
Yeah, and from
Like
an
your
enforcement
begonias
perspective,
aren't
you're-
gonna.
you're trying to enforce something that is going to be difficult. You know, you can make somebody rip up the bulbs, but they can just as easily plant them when they close their building permit. So, you know, like, as far as I'm concerned, like to Kaya's point, they're not particularly detrimental in either way, water or
Yeah.
like in general. So why try to police them?
Okay, excluding hoops and annuals, and then leave the plant list on
Yeah.
ones and on
Sure.
others. Do you want to leave it recommended for the people who have the water budget? Do you want it to be required for them?
I think
I don't see why you wouldn't require it for the higher intensity developments, honestly. I understand it's because the water budget sort of acts in lieu of that, but
Like my thought on that is like to potentially avoid people. It's kind of they ask for permission rather than forgiveness, like mentality where to avoid some weird scenario where somebody is really fixated on bringing in some sort of species that isn't going to play well with like the fauna around here, to have them bring it to our attention first and like have somebody be able to potentially intercede. And that also, I think, can potentially allow that plant list to be more like a living list, where when people
Yeah.
bring those in, we can kind of like determine if this something is something that fits within our community, and then add it to the list. And so like there's more growing options for people. And I think for people like myself, like there's a list. Cool. I don't have to think about this very much. Like, and I think most people are going to leave it at that. Like the people are going to be bringing in kind of those more exotic species and everything are going to be more one-off scenarios, but those are also generally the scenarios that you should be a little bit more careful about.
yeah, I'd be inclined to like require it for all three levels. And you know, like I said, one, it's a tool, and most people are going to grab that list and be like, great, I'll buy these things. And you know, going forward, it's not just about water. It's about, you know, preserving what is technically a very delicate ecosystem out here. And there are plenty of, like, we've seen it with things like tamarisk. It's not water friendly, but it also is massively detrimental to the native plants in the area. And it's just as easy to bring in another ornamental that we would think is water friendly, but that could cause problems in the community and in our ecosystem.
Ravenna grass, which is on the noxious list, but still.
Yeah, but it wasn't at first.
Just thinking, so that would be, this would be, so this wouldn't be like, I want to build a carport, so I have to tear out all my roses from the front.
If we do things on the required plant list for level 1, they do prescriptive function, it would, right? A carport would be a building permit.
Depending on the scale. So we have it built in within the scope. But what, generally speaking, I want to err on the side of saying, yes, what we're doing here is going to have implications. If you adjust a structural component, this is now part of the review system that would have to come into compliance if it were not in compliance. We do have parameters to that. As far as if you're adjusting your landscaping, a certain percentage of landscaping or square footage that you're adjusting, there's a threshold. But generally speaking, yeah, if there's a permit, you'll have to bring yourself into compliance.
Can we make that component? I wanna have good things be planted in the future, but I also don't wanna have people tear out their peonies and their rose bushes and the things that obviously aren't on the plant list, but for established vegetation. How do we
My
work
only argument
around that?
against that is that we, from our recent build out studies, we have a pretty good idea of our land areas,
Mhm.
particular to zoning especially. And this is something I've brought up to the staff, is that through that, the majority of our land area is in our R2 zone.
Yep.
Within that, that's single household, 2 household structures that are either established or will likely to continue to build within this level 1. Those areas are our highest water users. That's, I think, to be determined. This is conjecture a little bit at this point, because we are doing the analysis of commercial developments versus residential. But generally speaking, I think the identity of population use is the developments that we're more heavily restricting because of the ability for them to do those more complete developments are actually some of the lower level contributors to water use. The level 1 permits that we're looking here are the higher level users because of turf grasses, because of their irrigation systems that they're using, and just the sheer number of interior fixtures and all those additional components. So for me, if we're doing this, we're kind of committing to do it all the way for the purpose of the zoning practice and function, which is we're making fundamental change throughout. And so to only be preserving or rather, if we're pushing this off to just what we might call the more commercial or tourism industry, it will not effectively make the change that we're seeking. We have to apply it throughout. So while we've structured the approval sets this way, I think it does make sense within the review procedures. I think creating multiple exceptions in that capacity for our residential area, it's our residential users that we need to be adjusting this on. So for a carport, for expansion from a single household to a duplex, or from a single household to an ADU in a single household, this is where we need to be catching. That's the point, is that we're going to be catching them through all these things. Because if we don't catch them in those things, there is nothing that we'll catch them on, and that whole section of the water use will never be adjusted.
I think to address Kaya's concern, we could speak to an expert, a botanist, something like that, and have a very clearly defined way to like bring a plant onto our list. So if it was someone's roses, for example, that there would be clear and defined criteria that they could meet. That would be like, they fall within a certain amount of water usage. There'd have to be some allowance there. Now, not all going to be low water use plants, but that they are not harmful enough. They are not, it's a plant like that is acceptable enough. And because of the fact that it's already there, somebody could be doing their carport and, bring and be like, hey, I have these plants in my yard. They're not necessarily on the list, but there's a way to make them acceptable for the time. Whereas, if somebody has something that's basically noxious, but hasn't ended up on our noxious list, we could ask them to amend that. If we could define some.
Yeah, I
clear-
think the plant list makes me nervous because like fruit trees use a ton of water and probably aren't on our approved plant list. So you're saying that people have to tear out their peach trees if they're
So there are-
doing a carport?
We don't want to forget about the exemptions,
Oh,
and
Yeah,
then
that's the thing.
exemptions
That's
is
what I
one
want
point,
to
but
really
also the
define
water
the
budget
exemptions.
is a part of level 1.
yeah, the exemptions and exceptions take care of some things like food. But that is part of the argument for not requiring people to be on the plant list, or only making it for people who are on the prescriptive option and don't have the water budget, because it creates sort of a baseline for them of plants that we think are okay for this area. But if you have the water budget, then you could put the roses in and do something else that saves water elsewhere.
And from staff to staff, that's how I think we started out. But
Yeah,
then
I
it
think
adjusted
that-
throughout, where so in this context, 1 and 7 are now being applied. Originally, I thought it was, you had this
This
larger
is
group of
confusing.
requirements or
Certain.
water budget. It was kind of either or.
It is right now either or. Like the plant.
Oh, it is
list,
or 7. Okay, so we are in that context.
It's
So
1 to 5 or 7. The
So the-
others are 3 to 7. It skips the plant list
I got
right
you.
now.
I
right?
got you. So that does maintain it then with this
Yeah.
particular scenario where there's a historic property.
That's great.
they're
I
making
just don't want
adjustments.
people tearing out existing vegetation that's
They
not
could.
problematic.
If it's
basically.
valued and within the context of what's fits in their budget,
Yeah.
they would be able to maintain it
That-
and still do
that's
the
fine then.
carport, still
That's
do the
totally fine.
ADU.
Yeah.
Out for the water budget, and then in reverse, if they're building something new, they can stick to the first one.
Correct.
1 through 5.
Correct.
Yeah,
That,
and
that makes sense.
I'm definitely inclined to enforce the plant list more on larger developments and new things than
Yeah.
on people's existing homes.
Yeah.
We want to trend the way we're doing things. We don't necessarily want to make somebody tear out their roses.
Mhm.
So for level 3 right now, we're not requiring the plant list, but we did add in the full season turf. So this is like the bigger stuff. Do we want to leave it that way based off of what you just said?
Well, for the bigger stuff, I would be inclined to include the plant list.
Yeah, I think that we're pretty much in agreement on that.
So this one we go to 1 to 7. We give people some flexibility here in the middle. And then the bottom, you can either
Mhm.
go either way.
Because yeah, do
This-
we want people putting roses in on a new development? Not necessarily, but
This is how I think we originally structured. So part of my issue is like how we, through the middle of this, trying to work out, especially with the plant list, going from recommended one, like from a planning perspective was, if we're not requiring it, it might as well not be there. It can be a supplemental material from the
Yep.
sustainability department, but it should not be part of our municipal code. And right now it's even an appendix, so it's a supporting document. But this does make sense to me. This is a newer structure. We'll have to experience how applications come through, but as best as we can tell, this feels like it's going to make sense with all those in particular type scenarios, which we know will come up, but they are unique. I think we'll be able to accommodate those with what we're providing.
Well, I think this gives us a good framework to reference back to as we're dealing with those exceptions and exemptions.
Mhm.
We have something pretty clear to work from, and that kind of, I mean, that allows us to make reasonable decisions and have some reasonable like equity in the decisions we're making.
Cool. I think that's good for me. We're down to 2 left, and one of them is the exemptions and exceptions. So in here, like your fruit trees, things like that, could be in personal agriculture cultivation or permitted approved agriculture uses. For most people, it'd probably be personal, right? You're growing
Yeah.
food. Also keeping chickens, active recreation areas, cemeteries, things like that, that are excluded. It would affect the majority of like most people's just plain yards, but if you have a garden, it would not, you would not have to go to our fruit plant list and only like cultivate native foods.
Yeah, that would be a little ridiculous.
Pinyon pine and prickly pear tuna for everyone.
Maize.
And then, so these are kind of established ways you wouldn't have to do this. And then the exceptions right now are set up in ways, if you have some other reason you don't want to do it, what you would do. So the 2 questions here, or last 2, are we including the exemptions and exceptions that we want? And what is the process for getting an exception?
I'm curious about the process.
Okay. So I think a lot of this came out of our existing code. So I don't think this was established as what we want to happen. I think this was based
Mhm.
in.
Right. Is that a note on the side that references that? I can't-
Well,
does it go through the planning commission or someone?
where it came from.
Yeah.
Question for me is, seems a little random for it to go to a utilities director.
Right. And in essence, they would be qualifying the support of actual water use, but where original framing would have come is to the planning commission as the land use authority of the approval versus as a staff level, which the exemptions earlier were on the zoning administrator, which can be either planning, utilities director, depending on the particular scenario of what is being exempt, would be at a staff level there because it's written basically as a byproduct of a by right in the code. Exceptions is a concession. It's a discretionary concession based on criteria. So I would have that be the land use authority, being more than likely the planning commission, in some scenarios, the city council. But very unlikely would it be staff unless it was a level 1
That would make sense to me.
Makes sense.
application.
I could like kind of piggybacking off of what Miles had said. To a certain degree, I think if we do hire like an expert that can give like very clear guiding criteria, that we might be able to split that up. Because kind of like going off of the feedback that we got from that workshop, like some things are easier for like developers and they don't slow down the process quite as much if it can be done at an administrative level and like having to wait for a city council meeting or something like that. And so if we have things that fall within those like really clearly established like things, it can be done on an administrative level without really putting the burden on the administrative staff, where it's up to the individual to bring the supporting documentation that like I've done my research and it fits the criteria that you guys have set out for me. And then you just kind of check off like, you're right, meets this, meets this, meets this. But anything outside of that, where we're kind of deviating further from it, I think bringing it to a more of like a decision-making body might make sense. I don't know like how much complexity something like that would add.
That is pretty succinctly what I had in mind. Like, you'd have an easy way to onboard a plant onto that list to get something approved that, like you said, is administrative. It wouldn't require sitting in front of us. But anything that fell outside of that exception might require.
Yeah, like,
further
is
work.
this a plant that X? Is this a plant that,
And
is
I'm
it,
sure-
is it not going to spread to the ecosystem?
Yeah, I'm
is
sure
it-
like an
yeah.
expert, a botanist could give us a list of like, 10 bullet points that as long as a plant met those 10 criteria, at least wouldn't be long-term harmful.
Does subsection 6 of the criteria seem to address that sufficiently, or could we build that out more?
I think what you're essentially talking about is sort of an administrative checklist for almost an exemption by right,
An exception by
or
right?
excuse me, like an exception by right,
I-
which is
I'm
weird.
fearful of those.
Yeah.
Because we currently have those in the code and they
Mhm.
would function, except we, because we are not a public body, get charged with more authority than I'm comfortable with.
Yeah.
At a staff level. Because, when there's evaluation
Yeah.
necessary, that's where I want to bring it to the planning commission. So not to take it to a body and through that additional process if it is not required, but in this context, through the exceptions they'd be seeking, it makes sense that the land use authority that would have been doing the approval is the one that's, we will give a staff recommendation, usually with a professional, and
Yeah.
they're supplying a professional
Yep.
recommendation from the appeal side, we'll call it, or the exception side. And that's for staff to say, or not staff, for the body to say, yep, that does meet all the criteria. I can clearly vote yes on this, or I disagree with this, but it does meet all the criteria, so I'm voting yes anyway.
If somebody wants to do like a level 1, like they just want to build a carport, and they want an exception for whatever plan, a carport's not going to come to us anyways. So for in that case, looking for an exception,
Would come up to you despite you not being the
just still
approval
come to us
authority.
anyways. Hey, this person wants an exception. They're trying to
Yep.
do this. We say you're good to
Yep.
go.
The same
Pass
way
off.
a parking, except someone seeking a parking exception would
Right.
come to us when otherwise it might not.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I think that's fine. I think maybe I want it to be slightly easier than a parking exception, so.
Yeah,
if-
that's
if
pretty
there's a
robust with two.
Hearing, yeah, I don't want to.
That was my question. Do you want public hearings?
No, I
No,
don't.
It just
No.
comes before you as a request and then you approve
Yep.
the request through a resolution.
It will be publicly noticed.
Yep.
People will always have the opportunity to provide comment and feedback. We try to solicit that, but
Yep.
the public hearing element does add, that is something that I think if you're in final stages of something can get filled really.
yeah, it could be an
Onerous.
unreasonable burden.
Especially if it is just a building permit.
Yeah,
Where does the public input rest on that? And the answer is it shouldn't.
yeah.
That
Do you
makes
think
sense to me.
there's still value to us having some sort of forward-facing, like kind of like guidance to help them make
Yeah.
like decisions?
Well, I think
That's the-
just maybe a description of why the plants we have on our plant
Yeah.
list are on the plant list. And
Mhm.
so it's pretty easy to glance at it and say, well, my plant's not on that list, but I think it meets those, the overall like criteria. So I'm gonna go for it rather than being like, oh, it's,
Well, and somebody said something, right, like a clear process for getting a plant on the plant list. I think we could do some combination of if it meets like these 5 criteria and it's on the plant list, we'll just put it on, right? Like it's a native species, it's low water, it grows in our zone, whatever the criteria are. And then it wouldn't have to go to you if it meets those criteria. But if they're like, well, these are my grandma's roses, they could do it. Like it probably wouldn't meet our criteria, but they could ask for an exception. I mean, at least with a plant list type, there
Mhm.
could be stuff that's totally outside that, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That type of exception versus what I was thinking was a
Yeah.
more robust design and development
Stuff
standard
like that, I
exception.
think would still have to.
Plant list makes sense to have maybe a forward-facing criteria of like, hey, it doesn't meet it. Yes, because we know this is not a comprehensive list, which is the problem with a required list, is we know it may never get there, but we'll continue to improve it.
And that's going to cover most ground, especially for bigger developments. If somebody wants to come in with something is kind of exotic to the plant list,
I hate squishy language in statutes, as everyone here knows. This might be the one time when I would put a little bit of squishy language at the end. When I would say, or plant that meets these criteria. Because then you could sort of preemptively include those things without having to go through a process. You still have the ones that are the common, the available, the recommended, but you're distilling down what the criteria that got those specific plants on the list. So plants shall be X, Y, and Z, which may include, here's the list.
And if it is like a living list that people can reference and everything,
Yeah.
like it ultimately like just becomes an exhaustive list
Yeah.
or gets closer and closer to it.
Well, I like the descriptors of what the criteria are instead of the specific plants, because I'm not sure if we'd have to amend the code if we wanted to add plants.
And that's a good point.
question.
There's two factors here. One is I don't think that updating the plant list is necessarily an exception. I think that
No,
is-
not
that's a
at all.
proposal.
Right.
Yep.
And because it's part of an appendix, I don't think we'll have to update it through the same procedures, meaning
Mhm.
a fully noticed public hearing and plan commission and city council to update the appendix. We could probably, I will have to
It
check
used
in
to
with the state code.
It would be
Just once we
beneficial
adopt
when
the
somebody
appendix, but-
proposes something, if it's like, oh, this plant fits all these criteria, like, why not then just add it to the plant
think
list? And like you said, this living document that grows as we discover more,
Yeah.
because you sit a botanist down that is native to the area and he's not gonna think of all the things that are worthwhile planting here. So having a living list, unless it is required that there, like an exhaustive process be held just to
Yeah.
add a few plants to the list. In that case, I kind of like your idea, Kaya, where it's like, it either has to meet these criteria or be on this list. But if we could just be essentially onboarding everything that meets that criteria onto the list, then like you said, it would eventually become not a truly exhaustive list, but as darn
Get there.
close as we could get it.
I'll check, that'll have to be a legal review on what our capacities of an adopted appendix
It's like
amendment would be.
symbolism, just like growing plant list.
Very nice.
Stop smiling. Yeah, you might even save yourself some page numbers on code if you just decide to have the description of what the plants are, or not what they are, but the criteria of plants, and then say for a current plant list, go to moabcity.org/whatever.
Mhm.
And then you wouldn't even have to have it in the appendix, and you could update it as often as you update the website,
Mhm.
because that would not be part of the legislative definition. And so that wouldn't maybe require legally the same kind of hurdle.
Interesting.
You just
That might
have
be
the-
a
you have the
consultant question
description.
then. Because I don't want to lose the little bit of regulatory material we do get out of the plant
Yeah, yeah,
list by not having it
Okay,
officially adopted, but we'll have to weigh that of maybe a criteria would be sufficient to cover what our consultants believe.
Mhm.
maybe
Would
say
be
including but
comprehensive
not
that way.
limited to, here's our list of plants for a comprehensive current list
Yeah,
of advised species, go to Moab.
that could work.
Yeah.
That could work for a number of purposes. If
Because then you have concrete examples in the code that are there that aren't going
It-
away, but
it is required,
Growing
but it's
list.
not required off the criteria
Yep.
that can evolve and beyond. That could work, that dual system. Which the consultants might
And
like
it's
that
easy
even
for
better,
people
maybe,
I think
to
they
because they were
find.
struggling with the requiring a plant
Yeah.
list. There's not a lot of places that have done
it's
that.
easy for people to find them too, honestly.
Mhm.
It's
Corey, do you need anything else out of the process for this? Like which things go to which body?
No, I think I'm going to amend this to at least a planning commission body approval as land use authority if it's a
Mhm.
level 1, or going up to city council if it's a subjective like a pad or something else.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it'll be their decision, but with staff won't be the exception authority
that sounds
um,
totally good.
versus the utilities director. We might have the utilities director contribute on the recommendation, but not be the
Yeah.
zoning
Yeah, makes
administrator.
Cool.
Those were all of my questions.
This is fantastic. You've
Haven't
done a
done
really good
else.
job.
Well, I really appreciate your feedback. I think this will help us get a better next draft. If you have anything else tonight, or if you are going through this and have any other questions, just let us know and we'll try to work it in.
Please send us emails.
Yeah.
If you want.
Absolutely. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks, Lexi.
Nice.
You can get out of here if you want to.
Yeah.
We have one more item. I will say with this, the next steps are likely that we'll be noticing out for public hearing
Mhm.
on that. We can always table that item and continue to have discussions, but I would like to get the public hearing initiated so that we
Yeah.
can advance this. So we'll continue to work on this, have that noticed out, provide you and the public with the polished copy, and then it will still be a working document until it gets to city council after the recommendations made. All right.
Cool. All right. Our next item is a discussion item on a proposed text amendment, an application that came in for a proposed text amendment with a 2 household dwelling definition. This is item 5.1. This is a briefing and discussion.
We'll try to keep this as brief as possible. This is normally out of context where we would have just probably proposed through the public hearing and had that been the initial discussion. We don't often get text amendments from the public. It follows the same procedures as a zoning map amendment. But in this particular context, there was an individual who I'm believing is a home builder, could be maybe more qualified as a developer, and had some experience in Hawaii. And as they've come to Moab, identifying the housing crisis and looking for solutions or opportunities to generate more housing tools. And through that, coming to the planning office was asking about this potential use or style of developing, which is to condominiumize a duplex. Under our current code structure, the definition of a 2 household structure is under a single ownership, which under the definitions of condominiumization means essentially that that property could not be split up with that ownership overlay. I think at the surface level, what they're looking to do is create more opportunity for entry-level housing, which is, again, at surface level, I think an admirable pursuit, and which is why we want to bring it to discussion item tonight. Where it's maybe unique in Hawaii, we want to follow up with maybe that community to see how that has manifested itself through the actual development process. But with our particular community, we know for a fact, as opposed to maybe somewhere like Grand Junction or Bluff, where there isn't quite the tourism element or second home development that we have here, generating those entry-level houses often do go to authentic placement for those housing. So if somebody had a duplex and they split it, maybe it is indeed an entry-level housing household that purchases that, and it just creates another rung on the ladder of the housing stages. What staff, as we've evaluated this, we ran this through our development review team, we ran it through the administration, through the compliance team. We've really tried to branch out to see what benefits there could be, but also maybe what red flags there might be. Through this, we've surmised that the risk within our community of this tool being maybe utilized in a counterproductive way is more likely, or is a higher risk factor than it would be to maintain it as is. And to paint that picture, right now, a multi-house, or excuse me, a duplex, for lack of a better word, 2 household structure, will either have the owner living in one half and leasing out the other side, or maybe be a remote owner and they're leasing out both halves. So that's, either of those are a good scenario. One of the less optimal scenarios is that they maintain that as a second home on one side and then are leasing out the other side to maybe help subsidize that, which is not a bad issue. That is something that can exist right now. What this could do, and what I think the applicant is looking to do, is say, well, not only now could it be an owner and a leaser, but it can be an owner and an owner both living in each half. That would be the optimal opportunity there. But what it also on the same flip side of the coin could do is now that it could become a vacant second home and a vacant second home, whereas before it had to have at least one unit that was being rented. So when we've been analyzing this, it looks like, especially with the temperament of our development community, we would likely get a lot more of the less optimal option of them being utilized as second homes. More so to back this up, just beyond a sense of our community, is we saw this occur with one of our condominium developments that just went online and then had been in sale and pre-sales, advertised originally as affordable by design. This is for the community, but because of our climate, those units were smaller, therefore cost less, therefore became more attainable for entry-level second homeowners, not entry-level locals. And so they were bought up by outsiders really fast in cash before locals could even get their financing in order to even contest on those. That's our fear with these. So bringing it before planning commission and before this applicant goes down the full road of public hearing and submission is to open it up for your discussion review of maybe the benefits, pros and cons. And ultimately at this point, we haven't generated enough positive feedback that we would likely support a positive staff recommendation. That doesn't go on the record. We're just an advisory body in this regard. You would be the recommending body and then city council being the approval body. But from the ground level, if we're already starting there, we don't want to send this applicant down the road paying all the fees going through the process if we know it likely won't be successful. He of course will have that right to take it all the way to the end if he wishes. We want to be as kind of open and transparent about this as we can.
Yeah.
So I'd like to open it up for commission discussion, pros, cons, or otherwise, that we can maybe bring back to the applicant on your body's take on this amendment. I will say there's one alternative here. So through this process, one alternative that was discussed was potentially with this particular approval set would be an application process to condominiumize a particular type of structure, which is the two household structure. We could attach an AEH requirement to both halves of that. Now, that would be removing that less optimal version I talked about, where it's both a second home. It would not be able to be that. Now it would have to be occupied genuinely, but by either both owners or by both leasing sides. So it's all positive there. But where we see that being unlikely successful is that in the improvements it would take for a single household to be converted to a duplex or a duplex to be converted to a condominium is in the construction improvements that we require, the separation requirements, so to speak. Through that, the cost of the property would immediately jump to a point that we think the attainability would already be difficult. So for AEH, they may be putting themselves in the category where either the deed restriction gets revoked because it can't be filled authentically. So they use one of the parachute models from the ordinance, or we get one or two people in our community that can actually, it just makes its way to working and actually does work, but that's one or two families in our community versus the level of process, review, approval, qualification verifications, and compliance that we'd have to maintain all that staff work just for one level of benefit. So we didn't want to rule it out because if it's just even one more tiny tool in the toolbox, it's worth evaluating. But even the AEH is kind of a long shot in this context to apply. I'm not sure if we even have the legal structure in this scenario because it would be a by right function, not a annexation agreement or development agreement, which is where the AEH can be applied more liberally. So we may have to do a findings study to prove that nexus option for this. I'm not quite sure. So
Do you see this being implemented in existing condos or excuse me, in existing duplexes, or will
That-
be applied in future developments to something that maybe they would have subdivided and made it twin homes?
thank you for bringing that up. And
That
again,
changes
we had
the conversation, because if you have to go through the process to condominiumize an existing duplex, why does that even stay in the realm of being attainable housing then after?
Right.
If it-
I didn't have exhaustive communication with the applicant to
Mhm.
understand, but from what I understood is that he was going to be pursuing either converting single households into two households that then could be condominiumized, or existing two households that would then be condominiumized, not vacant land developed off the bat as this condominium duplex. Because like Kai is saying, you could just do a twin home and be done with it, and it works that way versus going this roundabout function, which is far more complicated. So that's my assumption, is that it's gonna be conversions that are occurring, not new developments.
I guess I don't, and I would absolutely love to hear more from the applicant, sort of background where this, I think in this instance, we obviously can't be pre-decisional about a particular project, but I think understanding the specific context in which this would apply and why this would be a good thing, why it's better for the community to have more home sales than more long-term rentals. That is not a winning argument to me right now, honestly. I think we have a shortage of both. So I guess I would be curious, like you said, like needing to put in firewalls, needing to do all the things you would need to be able to condominiumize a duplex. Would it even be attainable or affordable after that? Or would that make it, I mean, I don't know if you could buy the whole duplex for $500,000, but then you could buy one side of the duplex after all that work was put in for $400,000. It's like, okay, it's a little bit of a wash to me.
Mhm.
So I guess I'd be curious about I would love to hear specifics maybe of like an example. I don't know.
And that's, we did reach out to the applicant today, let him know we were having this discussion. It wasn't an open forum comment for him to come in and speak. If he wanted to write something, I think,
Yeah, he'd be
I think we
welcome
offered
to.
it, that he could write something into us. But more importantly is that we want to have this context that if he does take the next step, he's prepared to come during the public hearing and truly
Mhm.
explain all these components. So listening to tonight's
Yeah.
meeting and hearing what your comments are, I think he could take that and propose something if he does want to move forward.
Mhm. I also think we don't quite know the parameters of how things are going to shake out from the legislative session this year, where we know municipalities don't have the ability to proactively regulate fractional ownership. And this is one place in the code where it specifies single owner. And so I am a little loath to take out an
Mhm.
existing code provision that may end up
Mhm.
being sort of a backstop against that applying absolutely everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, Those are sort of that's my vibe on it.
In general, I tend to feel like when I look at this, I consider how much it could benefit the community and how much it could be abused. And in this particular instance, I think, I mean, by the nature of the housing in our community and the fact that when more affordable housing pops up, it often does not go to community members. I think without being able to apply some requirement, EH or otherwise, like it just opens it up too freely to people buying houses and flipping them and basically just increasing their profit, allowing them to take a house, separate it, do that firewall, which is expensive. But then when you could turn around and sell two separate properties here in town, that, I mean, you'd make that expensive more doing that. And I doubt they'd be sold like at a very reasonable price to a local. I think, as the market goes, they'd be sold for as much as they could.
Yeah, it's that.
So I don't really see that, benefiting our community. I see it as just another way to kind of essentially sell more second homes, build more,
It's that like give to get, I think, goal with our existing code. If we are not opening things up, but if we are like kind of changing things now to make it easier or more friendly or what have you for certain kinds of development or new development, I think like assurances on that, the same way with height, the same way with parking, like what we're doing. We know we don't have new tools in the toolbox we can really use to incentivize affordable and attainable housing. So we have to use what we work with and what are the things in the code that are like like not the favorite thing of someone who's trying to build or develop. We take those and we get something in exchange for it. The community, I should say, gets something in exchange for it. And I kind of see this as that.
Mhm.
I would see it the same way, being like, yeah, it makes sense to raise height maybe across the board, but we need some sort of
Mhm.
parameters on that, or we don't have any,
Mhm.
we don't have any bargaining chips left, essentially.
Mhm.
And it stinks to have to say that. I wish it was a different world where just flat out creating more housing stock for sale was the answer to all our problems, but it's just still not. I think it's getting better,
Yeah.
but it's just not. Yeah. Luke?
Like when I heard this, it was kind of screaming just like even earlier entry Picasso to me. Where it is these like smaller units that are kind of being made available for fractional ownership. Like the one thing that I do try to keep in mind, and like, yes, there's an absolute dearth of both like homes for sale and rentals, but there is value in trying to get more members in our community to get into home ownership, just because one of the biggest issues, like in a lot of the like kind of groups or committees or whatever that I've been on, that's identified, like it's always been the two biggest issues in our community are lack of housing and intergenerational poverty. And like the way that the American system's set up, one of the best ways to address intergenerational poverty is through home ownership. But yeah, I am concerned that we are still at a point where our locals cannot compete in the market, regardless of how many homes we build right now, because there's just such an intense interest in our local community that they're going to get bought up cash. I don't know how many local residents we have that can just put down a couple $100,000 in cash. And if they can, they're not really in the position for an entry-level home. And so my kind of thought on this is like, if we do apply something like the AEH on it, once again, our locals can't compete in the market, so they're going to get bought out by like outside investors or interests. And we're at a situation where it's a duplex that is being rented out by locals. And so we already have that. And so it's like, why go through this entire roundabout process to get to a point that we're already at?
Right.
Yeah.
Displacing maybe one of the remaining housing types that is long-term occupied by locals.
That
too.
was kind of one of my more clear kind of concerns in this, is that we would, because it was geared towards conversions, not towards new generation. If it's new generation, that's kind of added
It's interesting.
added
yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
But if it's conversion, we are immediately removing whatever viable rental stock we have. So it's again, that inverse housing correlation where it's being viewed as more doors, but really it's actually removing housing
Yep.
stock
Yeah.
from one pool to the other, which are both very thin.
No, and I'd love for this individual to like disprove all of these
Mhm.
concerns that we
Mhm.
Yeah,
have. Because
totally.
the more tools that we have, the greater. And I really would love to be able to identify something that we can do to help promote home ownership in our community. Because I think it promotes like really kind of building roots and investment in the community. And that's something that like it is a return on an investment for the individual and for the community as a whole. To me, that's kind of a multiplier, but I don't foresee this being an option. And I think a lot of us have almost like this trauma response to some of these things, because like we have in good faith tried to create these things. And like you said, these things that were targeted and like marketed as like early entry, like home buying options are seen as like an investment opportunity, or just like broadening the second home market, because now like we've made second homes more affordable to a larger segment of the population. So it's not, I think it's not without real reason why we have these like hesitancies. And I would love to be, like I said, proven, but unfortunately, because of the experiences that we've had, there's a pretty high hurdle we have to cross.
Mhm.
In that regard.
I think there's some sort of satirical shirt, Moab, like entry-level second homes for everyone. Terrible.
And
Sad.
just-
It's
I-
the truth.
Sad.
we so often do compare ourselves to island communities and are researching other island communities and there's some of their solutions. So when somebody was coming from one of these communities
Yeah,
saying this
absolutely.
was here,
You
I
said
would
they're
be
from Hawaii?
Hawaii.
Yeah.
I think.
No,
Big
I
Island-
don't,
Big Island,
like, I
but
don't want to like poo-poo this because I think at least as an elected official, like I've been like hollering about like, please like come to
Mhm.
us with your
Mhm.
ideas.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
the
yeah.
more ideas and the more perspectives that we can get, like the better off we're gonna be. It's gonna help us like make more informed decisions or like recognize like we haven't fully like explored all options out there and there might be something out there that really it's not going to be the silver bullet that's going to like solve our issue, but it's going to be another tool that we can use to like better tailor our responses to our community needs. So like I'm really appreciative of like trying to get creative and trying to like bring solutions to our community. I just have concerns about the ways in which this can be abused and will be abused because we only have so much control over this, and a lot of it ultimately comes down to market forces where we have basically no control over that.
Yeah, or any, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze.
Sadly,
Bless you.
Sorry. I mean, yeah, and I would certainly be open to, if the interested party or the applicant was, if there were like parameters, sorry, that could be built in some way that weren't the AEH, but yeah, I don't know what
Yeah.
that would look like.
and that's where this would likely go from what is a single strike
Yeah.
in the text amendment to a
Big ol',
new
yeah.
chapter
Yeah.
of how to process. So it would be a robust, and again, if we gain even a couple more local houses, it could be
Yeah.
conceivably worth it.
Awesome.
If we put those parameters in that they're protected and we understand, yeah, it's not going to work for everyone. And most of the time it might not pencil, but in scenarios it does, it's at least these many more. But I think to Luke's point, if what will likely happen is the fact that it'll basically turn right back into what it was, except the equity is going outside instead of the equity probably being maintained inside. Then we just have split up the equity for the outside. We haven't done anything effective to the community.
We'll say as
with the AEH.
proposed as just the strike now, no.
I think that's helpful. I think
Like
Ruben
hard,
hasn't
like
given too
hard
much of
no
a
on just that
concept.
with
I think
nothing
Miles would-
additional, with no context.
We're
And I would
kinda-
venture that council would probably agree.
I feel comfortable that this would not be like, I don't say looked at favorably, but yeah, I think there'd be a lot of very strong observations about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't want to speak on behalf of others.
Sure. Ruben, did you have any additional components to that?
No, I think everything was hit perfectly
Okay.
on the head. I mean, to start with, my only question was going down the AEH path of like, well, what are the requirements with AEH? And I think it's more than 3, right? For any multi-residential.
Yeah.
And so,
Right.
when you start to break it down less than that, you are looking into just, well, now you're just making more cases for second homes, so there's no
Yeah.
reason to do it.
Right.
So I don't even think that we should entertain it.
With just as, I mean, and again, if we're wrong about this, if we're not seeing a valve that's on there,
Yep.
I hope the applicant is listening to this discussion, understands the reservations. I'm happy to explain some of the history and all of that kind of stuff if
Mhm.
they want to reach out. Because like Luke said, we want to be creative and we don't just want to be like, but literally just the like striking of the single
Sure,
ownership thing,
sure.
it's like, oh man.
Sure, Sure.
With nothing else, with no other descriptions or
Mm.
parameters.
Mhm.
But if there's things that can be built in an easy fashion, or if there's a specific example of where an instance where this would work and wouldn't result in sort of the unintended consequences, I would love to discuss that or hear it, and then we can.
Okay.
I will say, I feel bad for not even having known that duplexes were under a single ownership. I
Mhm.
wasn't even aware of that case, and I'm not entirely sure why, to begin with.
Yeah.
Why is it the case that it was always under a single ownership?
Because it's a single parcel.
Because
Right.
it's a
Of
single
land.
parcel, so the person who develops
Parcel,
it.
one building.
That's
Yeah.
the big difference between twin home, which is 2
Yes.
versus a duplex, which can either be stacked or side by side. But
Okay.
the construction type and separation of utilities. So construction type between what we'd be looking at with a 2-household dwelling and this condominium may not be all that different, like we talked about party walls and separations of elements, but talking about this through DRT, our utilities director said, yeah, they probably have to rip up if it's existing and then split those utilities, get separate meters, install again, a lot of improvements
A
that,
duplex does have that. A duplex is completely separate with utilities and having a firewall, and then the conversions they would
Twin home,
want to do, a twin home.
yep.
Okay,
And duplexes, you have a single meter base, it's a single property owner, and then you can split that on a bill internally, but that's privately done, not publicly done.
okay.
But
So
you-
it gets into minutia, but the next category up is a larger category.
Got it. Okay, I see.
Same difference between like apartment and a condominium. Essentially, you literal. physical
Apartment and a
property.
condominium, that makes sense. That's the,
Like,
Yeah,
you're,
that's a good way to
even
put
if
it.
you're in a complex, your condominium, you literally own the parameters of your
Mhm.
dwelling.
yes, whereas you own a condominium, that's,
Yeah,
Well, that gives, I think, staff enough direction to reach back out to the applicant, have some discussion, potentially resubmit with alternatives or advance
Mhm.
this as is
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
provide a narrative and summary and kind of some feedback during the public hearing. So we'll
Mhm.
wait to hear
what's,
from him.
what's that's the procedure for this, not recommendation,
This is a
This is
discussion
a
item.
discussion.
So no action required and there's no motion at the end of this. This is purely to bring this up, to have this conversation before pulling it in front of a public hearing where maybe you wouldn't have had enough time
Okay.
to feel informed, and then the applicant may have felt like they weren't informed about
Yeah.
what staff or the commission's.
okay, this isn't
position was
something
on.
where you can go back and say, well, this is what the planning commission said. We probably won't push it further unless you really want to.
That is what he will.
that is-
Tonight, so hopefully he's watching and has heard this whole
I see, yes,
discussion. If he
got it.
hasn't, we'll recap.
But
that.
this is just our discussion. This is our
Yep.
thoughts. This is not us actually considering something
Well, sure, yeah.
as a decision item, as an
Yes.
action item with
Yep.
a public hearing.
I was just wondering if this was still going to go and then further discussion.
may.
so-
And he has,
may,
the-
and
he
it
has the
may.
opportunity, but
Yeah.
now he's a little bit better informed about
Right.
like the initial
Yeah.
like feeling.
Sure, sure.
And so he can make that decision, like, do I really want to push this? Do I think that, like, what, based on this response? And do I think I can address their concerns in a meaningful way? Like, what do I think my long-term chances of actually pushing this to a successful?
Perfect.
Cool.
And hopefully. But why is also a mess as far as.
Yeah.
getting going forward.
Well, that, I think with that item, that's all I need.
That was, thanks, Corey. For what it's worth, I think this is great. I think just seeing this on the agenda tonight, had a couple people in the community being like, what's going on? I think that's a good thing. I think that's always a good thing. Yeah. On that note, speaking of people in the community knowing what's going on, I have some feedback to provide to planning staff. There are some letters that went out regarding the proposed development on Mill Creek. I was shown a copy of one of those letters. I am not an adjacent landowner, but I know people that are. It was, I will say, quite infuriating, the lack of detail on that letter. It was a very, I think it felt to several of the adjacent property owners like there was, it was like, we're checking the box of notice, but we're not actually telling you absolutely anything that's going on in a way that will allow you to meaningfully know if you want to engage or not. And I understand that we're meeting our legal requirements, but I also feel like if we can do better, man, that'd be great. Because I think it came
So,
across really poorly, honestly.
Yeah, I think those letters came from the developer or the applicant, not from the city. I did
That's
have
True,
someone
for sure.
come in.
Yeah.
I did have someone come in asking for clarification and she walked away fine,
Yeah,
but we might need to, yeah, let the applicant know he needs to do a little bit more
if
clarification on
that's,
it.
we need to do a code amendment to require the applicant to provide a higher degree of information. I don't know what it is.
Sure, and that's
now.
what the issue is really, is that currently our code requires that the applicants provide noticing.
Yeah.
And we're doing that unsuccessfully. So the city provided a template that said, here is what meets your legal parameters. So when you are talking about a very dry, legally based letter,
Yeah.
that's probably where the basis was for that. I think the staff direction along with that letter to cover their legal boundaries was also provide additional materials to show what it is you're doing. And that was at the discretion of the applicants and developers to do that.
No.
So it is exactly what you're feeling. Like, it feels like they're checking box. That's exactly what they're doing.
No,
The
absolutely.
letter reads like it came from the city.
No, it was signed by the street address LLC. So 1537 Mill Creek LLC.
That was one of the complaints, is that there wasn't any contact.
No contact
information.
I mean, it honestly, if you're being like really skeptical, I think people don't understand that doesn't come from the city, or the city doesn't have oversight. I think it reflects really poorly on open public governance, even if it's not
Sure. And
us.
to your point, that was something that our current attorneys and planning staff are identifying, is we need to remove that.
Yeah.
So we've provided a legal structure that they are going to meet the requirements according to the code. We can't require them to do anything more, but as soon as we do our code update, we're going to remove that responsibility
Yeah.
from them and put it back on the city to do
Okay.
it in a way that we feel comfortable and
That's-
that the
that's good
public
to
is getting
know.
engaged correctly.
Cause yeah, it's like there's a level 2 site plan scheduled for consideration pursuant to the code. You have the right to submit written comments, but it's like, what is it? What's happening?
Yep.
What are they doing? What does
Right.
this mean?
Really have an incentive to try to like minimize as much response as possible.
What have they said that they're doing?
Right.
We're
some
Nothing.
vague-
Something?
It literally said there's a level 2 site plan. You should engage
If you want.
on TBD date at the planning commission. It's just, it's not good.
It
It's not
didn't
good.
have an actual date though,
Mm-mm,
because
no.
it's not scheduled.
TV.
No.
Right, they're still working through the process.
Yeah, totally. And I understand the process, but it was like,
So
I think it has the opposite effect of like informing neighbors. I think it's just kind of like
Mhm.
it's kind of feels
The
like. a
fact
little
that it doesn't
slap in
have
the face.
a contact information is, I think, a little troublesome, because Anna did spend some time with one of the neighbors. I think even the building department had communicated with a neighbor or two, calling in maybe. And we're happy to sit down and walk you through the publicly available documents on that site for anybody in the community.
Yeah.
But it's something where we'd like that to be the responsibility of the developer to be neighborly and coordinate. That's the intention of the code. I disagree with that code. It shouldn't be their job. It should be our job to do it right. But right now, that is the intent
Yeah.
of the code, is for them to kind of be outreaching and offer opportunities for input, whether written or directly to the developer, to even shape the development.
Yeah.
So if we send it out, we can ensure that we include their contact info on there.
Yeah.
Our contact info so that they can
Well,
call us. and
Well,
we
but
can
so that if a neighbor wants to
between
talk
the
to the developer,
applicant
they
and-
can do that.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think the biggest issue with this really is just like, I think people have really small bandwidth for knowing and engaging, and
Mhm.
they need to know as early and as clearly as possible
Mhm.
if it's something they want to engage on. Like, this would be the same exact letter for a Walmart going in as it would be for a new single family home. And I think that is very concerning. You know what I'm saying? Like, people have no clue what it is. And if it's something that's something they might want to pay attention to, or something they're like, oh, cool,
Or-
Joe's building a house, you know?
And that is a struggle we're going to go with in evolving as a community, is that most of our code is designed off of community input, regardless of ability to alter the result.
Yeah.
We know with the planning commission, if it meets the code, we are required to approve it regardless of our personal desires with that. And that's part of what this is an issue of, is that we're now doing broad noticing to public to engage, when really none of their commentary can alter
Yeah.
on a legal premise the actual approval, which creates contention of,
Yeah.
well, I voiced my concern, why was it not resolved? And that creates a little bit of an issue just between the applicants and the community and the city, and then even with the developers themselves. So that's a whole structure of the code
Yeah.
we're going to have to rewrite.
Like I appreciate that desire for public input, and like to ideally be able to like connect the developer with like community members, like you said, to be neighborly, where like I think like the whole education of like, as long as they meet like the criteria, then like the planning commission is required to say yes. So like if you want to make sure that like they're not just checking off boxes like indiscriminately, but like are taking your like desires of the community into consideration, like that's where the input has to go. Like, we can say like, yes, I agree with you, I agree with you, but at the end of the day, like, once that's down in front of like the staff or any of these bodies where it is kind of an administrative decision, like, it's all over their hands. Like,
Yeah.
sure.
Totally.
But yeah, no, that to me just feels like like it was done in a way to provide as little, like the fact that it was sent out before a meeting is even scheduled, like
In order to discourage a response.
there's so little to take action on there, that you know, like where to go if you want to take action.
So is what you're saying is you would like to see the city find a way to get more grassroots, like input and
I think it's like, to me,
type of things like community individuals type of.
I think to me, like one of the things that I recognize, like stepping into like city council, is one of the most important like facets of my job is really public education. Is there is this like lack of an understanding. So like, I would think that when there is a public hearing, that is an opportunity for me to speak up and express my concerns to like the decision-making body, so that those considerations, or so that my input can be taken into consideration.
Rather than it being a formality. that you just
Yeah,
said.
or really what I think the intent should be is so that the applicant can hear the input from the community, but my misconception on that is going to completely change the way in which I try to deliver my message.
Or what the message is.
Yeah. And so like having that understanding of like, and I really appreciate it. There has seemed to be a more concerted effort to educate like what really are just administrative decisions where there is no room for like any sort of like independent thought or anything like that. It is just checking off boxes that like there are frustrated people in our community, and a lot of those people have like a very limited bandwidth or a very limited capacity to engage, and like for them to be engaging in a way that like takes a lot out of them to have like zero results every single time because it is in a system that is designed like if that's where you're like thrusting your energy, you're never getting anything back. Like to me, it kind of like disincentivizes people from engaging in this like civic process, and like that's what we need now, like less more than ever.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and I think a very good concrete example is the last time we met, or 2 times ago, we were discussing the new development on Miles Street, where the letter that was sent to us
Mhm.
specifically highlighted ways that it may not meet the legal requirements for that development. It
Mhm.
wasn't saying, I'm an adjacent neighbor, I'm affected by this and blah. It was saying like, you guys have boxes to check administratively. Here's why I don't think it checks those boxes. And I think if a broader swath of the community understood like at the administrative stage or with most of the stuff we do, that's not, subjective or
Mhm.
legislative,
Mhm.
that was a way, it's like I engage with the BLM all the time. I comment on stuff. I'm pointing out ways that they are or aren't in compliance with the law. I'm not just weighing in on like if I like the project or not. So, those are the effective comments. And they say that when they solicit comments, they're like the most effective comments are this, and this.
Mhm.
So I think maybe if this is a bigger picture thing, certainly, but I think it would be really great if you could say like, here's the things they have to, meet. Here's the
Mhm.
requirements they have to meet. If they
Mhm.
meet these requirements, the project can go forward. Is there a way that they don't meet the requirements that we're missing? We're looking to you,
Mhm.
community, and,
Yeah. And that's
and
our
that
hope.
one. Yeah.
To publicize that more is in the Cottonwood condominiums approval recently was that matrix of criteria.
Yeah.
That
was
is
awesome.
a blanket strip of everything we are looking at checkbox wise. Some of those boxes aren't always yes or no. It's a discretionary interpretation that we have to follow a trail on. Those are the areas that somebody in the community, if that's part of the packet, say, well, I'm following that trail. I need more information on this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Obviously, we're hoping that our planning staff in a professional capacity is doing that
Of course. Yeah.
correctly, but in the scenario that there is a concern with that, or a disagreement of our interpretation, that is the community's job.
Mhm.
What I'd like them to maybe gear that energy towards is not so much our interpretations of it, because at that point it has been consistently probably approved for many years, but it's, sorry, Luke, to gear all that energy towards the council to change the code.
Yeah.
Because then the code is clear. We interpret off of what the city council's new code says, and then that is a resolution. So I think it's, like Lou said, this continued energy going against a failed appeal, meaning they're trying to get a reaction out of what should be the land use authority body, but you have no power to deny that at that point.
Yep.
So it is, hey, this code, even if it's not questionable, I just don't like it. Let's do what this person that we were just talking about is doing and say, well, I want to file a text amendment.
Yeah, and I think that really empowers like our community members and like city staff or like volunteer individuals on the boards to have much more effective and meaningful conversations. This made me think of like working at Sea Haven, where like we had some requirements because of grant funding that like we absolutely had to adhere to, and like not knowing that, it made us look like we were just like these obstinate like jerks who didn't want to listen to anybody else. But it was like, no, like we literally have to follow this or we are risking losing our like entire funding stream. And once we explained that, like it made those conversations a lot more like understandable. And like I can see, I'm hoping that if we get to that point, then people can leave feeling like, even if I didn't get my way or my desired outcome or something, like we had a productive conversation, and like I can see where they're coming from. I might not agree with it, but like at least we're starting off closer together with one another, rather than like screaming from like across a football field and like hoping the message gets like through. And so like that to me, I think is just something that can like really help ideally rebuild a lot of mistrust and just kind of despondency that I've noticed with segments of our community. And like I think that's something that can go a long way in terms of like helping push developers to be a bit more neighborly, like helping kind of build a sense of community that a lot of people in this town feel is eroding. So I'm all for it. I'm really excited to hear that that's kind of the direction that you're all headed in, because it is. It's like, how can we empower our citizens? How can we empower our leaders to like work together as well as possible? And it's not always going to be pretty, but yeah, if we can at least start off on, yeah, the thing that I was keep coming back to is like, if we can't agree upon like what the basic facts are at the beginning of this, like we can't move forward and have a meaningful conversation. So like literally handing people like, these are the facts that this is going to be like judged against, like that's the start right there. And like we can all agree like that is the start.
I love the matrix. I
Yeah.
love, that was so incredibly illuminating
We've-
seeing what you
and
guys,
what's kind of been more of an obvious thing is we do that for every project
Yeah.
internally. It's so usually extensive and cumbersome. We don't provide it because it can get lost in it.
Yeah.
But now that will be a standing exhibit in every approval you'll review, is you'll be able to go through the code extensively on every provision that's being reviewed.
yeah, like I've been on planning commission for 3 years now, 3+ years,
Plus,
probably.
yeah.
I don't even remember.
Plus.
Good Lord. I learned more looking at that matrix than I think I've picked up in all the site of plan approvals that I've done my entire time on planning commission. So it was like incredibly illuminating and educating for us too, for the things, because we ultimately are the ones that are supposed to, if there's something to be caught, we're the citizens who are supposed to catch it.
Right.
And so I feel more empowered to do that now,
Absolutely.
honestly. So, but yeah, I think it was really just, I just wanted to raise the concern that a couple citizens had brought and sent me that letter. And I was like, man, that's not helpful to anybody.
Yeah.
But it's good to hear. So I can come back and let them know that like in the future, we are making it so that will come from the city. It will have more information. It will have contact information. It will have,
But there's a process, a
Yeah.
pretty long process we're gonna have to go through to
yeah.
get to that.
But maybe at least up until that point, really encouraging
Mhm,
applicants,
mhm.
say like, look, we know here's what the requirements are, but if you want to foster goodwill with your soon-to-be neighbors or the community, it'd be really great if you were like, by the way, this is what we're gonna do here, or this is what we're thinking about, and here's my phone number.
Mhm, mhm.
I
Yeah.
do appreciate the citizens for bringing that to your attention because it gives us the opportunity to take like meaningful action in terms of like, this is not going to play well in town.
Well, and I think it's worth noting that it was citizen who brought it to my attention, who's a former planning commissioner. So, and that's really excellent and also makes me sad because I know there's probably been a lot of letters like this that have confused people to the point where they're like, I don't know what this is, I'm not gonna pay attention, but they didn't know the avenue to engage about.
Yeah.
So,
No, and to me, like, this is just like further kind of impetus to like continue pushing the rest of council to like, there's so many reasons why really changing a lot of our code like as soon as possible. It's gonna have this
Yes.
tremendous benefit for our community.
yes,
So.
well,
I
it
appreciate
is
that. Yeah.
late, and I don't want to take all the time. What are our future agenda items?
We'll likely be scheduling the public hearing for the landscape ordinance, potentially this code amendment. So they'll be coming right back to you, at least in that public hearing format. I don't think that we have any site plans prepared at this point. There may be a few resubmittals coming in this
Hopefully
end of the
soon.
week or next week that may be because we have a gap now
Cool.
between meetings. But yeah, there's nothing immediately scheduled.
Sweet.
Um,
I will flag again that I will be gone the next planning commission meeting, the next scheduled one. So if we don't have,
I'll say now that I can show up.
okay,
I'll
if
be
we
here.
don't have Miles Rubin and Jill. we
And
won't
Jill
have a
should
quorum.
be,
Okay,
I believe. And to that note, I think the mayor is processing or trying to advance the
Oh, good.
appointment of a new
excellent,
planning commissioner, hopefully.
great, very cool, sweet. Thank you all. This was a long meeting, but like very engaged.
Can I
Um,
Yeah.
say that I
Great, best discussion I've had. in
You
my
know,
few
it's
meetings.
awesome. I will,
think we planted a good seed.
yeah. Oh my God. Oh my God, guys. Oh.
Close
That's
this
a
out,
dad
let's go.
Oh. How hard is it to work no dad jokes into the code amendments?
Ugh.
That's what I want to know. And thanks, Luke, for your a little more participation
Yeah,
than
thank you.
is traditional, but I think it was worthwhile. So,
And I really want to thank the staff for all the work that you guys are putting in, like just dealing with the day-to-day stuff, but all this like forward thinking stuff is really exciting. And like really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
Corey's setting it up for when Wyatt is the planning commissioner for the city. He's trying to leave a trail of happiness instead of tears.
That's right.
All right, I will adjourn this meeting of Moab City Planning Commission at 9:13 PM. Thanks, everybody.